Chapter 2:21. You like to fight with your life on the line? Caroline revealed a sinister smile. I can fulfill your wish. She was different from Betty. Betty was an expert in magic, while she was an expert in close combat. The difference in their innate talents as vampires was even greater. Betty had a mysterious ability in the spiritual aspect, and she had an incomparably powerful recovery ability. It could be said that she was not afraid of fighting with her life on the line. Even if it was an 11th grade powerhouse, as long as she could persevere, the final victor would be her. I have other wishes. Can you satisfy them all? Han Jin asked with a smile. Caroline was too lazy to respond to Han Jin's frivolous words. She slowly loosened her fists, and a sound similar to that of bellows could be heard in the arena. It was the sound of Caroline's labored breathing. She seemed to be enduring intense pain, and her entire face was contorted. Following that, rows of sharp bone spikes slowly grew out of her hands, arms, and back. Under the sunlight, the tips of the bone spikes emitted a dark blue chilling light, giving off a chilling feeling to the onlookers. Are you constipated? Han Jin laughed. He had his hands behind his back, looking calm and unruffled in the midst of chaos. It seemed that he did not care at all about Caroline's changes, and even gave Caroline enough time to improve her combat ability. In the next instant, Han Jin's figure shot out like a bolt of lightning. With a wave of his right hand, a green ray of light shot into the air, intersecting with the red ray of light as it shot towards Caroline. At the same time, the long whip in Han Jin's left hand whistled out. The tip of the whip aimed towards Caroline's throat like a poisonous snake. Normally, Han Jin was a gentle and quiet young man, always wearing a harmless smile. However, when faced with a threat, his desire to attack would become very strong. Although the method of creating illusions and deceiving the enemy was still very childish, it was a reflection of his nature. Caroline's figure moved. Her speed was extremely fast, even faster than the long whip in Han Jin's hand. With just a flash, she escaped Han Jin's attack range. With another flash, she approached Han Jin's side and waved her sharp claws, striking at Han Jin's neck. If it were anyone else, they would definitely try to dodge or block Caroline's attacks. However, Han Jin had his own fighting style, and he could see that his opponents were far more terrifying than he had expected. Thus, he chose to injure one of them at all costs, and then combined with Edwina to attack the other. Han Jin straightened his shoulders and faced Caroline fearlessly. At this moment, Betty suddenly screamed, "Watch out for his fire!" Han Jin was extremely shocked, but at this moment, he had no way out. Caroline's hand hit his shoulder. Han Jin endured the intense pain and turned his body, dispersing Caroline's strength. His right hand reached out to grab Caroline's arm. At the same time, a golden flame appeared in his palm. Caroline had already heard Betty's warning. Her body fluttered to the other side like flowing water, and with a backhand punch, she hit Han Jin's left rib. Spitting out yet another mouthful of blood, Han Guang was sent stumbling to the right by Caroline's attack. This was the only way to reduce the damage he received. Even though he had already unleashed his spirit possession technique, he was still unable to endure the successive heavy blows. His sword, Betty warned again. Two flying swords left flashes of light in the air as they shot forward. Caroline's speed suddenly increased, and she closed in on Han Jin before the flying swords. She punched Han Jin in the chest. Han Jin's chi and blood were in turmoil. Whether it was his speed, strength, or reaction time, they were all affected. He barely managed to block Caroline's fist with his right hand, but he could not block the continuous attacks. With a muffled groan, Han Jin was already flying backward. However, Caroline did not let him go. Like a shadow, she chased after him. Punch after punch landed on Han Jin's chest. "Fire!" Betty shrieked. Caroline suddenly pulled back her fist, and Han Jin's hand once again grabbed empty air. The golden samadhi true fire burned quietly, but it could not unleash its full power. Caroline's figure paused for a moment before she kicked Han Jin's abdomen, avoiding the ball of flame. Han Jin was sent tumbling away, breaking a thick tree into two. He then landed heavily on the ground, causing mud and snow to splatter in all directions. A pure white screen of light suddenly appeared, and Han Jin slowly climbed up from within. The blood flowing from his mouth had already dyed half of his body red, but his eyes were still very clear. Caroline was not afraid of Han Jin's pure light curse, and she pressed forward step by step. Han Jin stared coldly at Caroline as he pondered. Why didn't Edwina make a move? She must have chosen the wrong target. An archer's most threatening attack was without a doubt an unexpected arrow. Edwina didn't want to waste her time, so she had been waiting. Han Jin lashed out with his whip. It looked like he was going to attack Caroline, but his body suddenly disappeared and sank into the ground. He then rose up where Betty was. Unfortunately, at the same time that Han Jin attacked Caroline, Betty had already floated into the air. She pressed down with her left hand, and a blood-red ball of light flew out of her hand and smashed into the empty ground. She then pushed her hand forward, and another blood-red ball of light flew towards the snowy hill. Han Jin dug out from the ground and saw nothing except a ball of blood. Then, as if he'd been punched in the face, he fell to the ground with his face facing the sky. With a boom, the second ball of blood that Betty had released exploded. The ball of blood turned into a rain of blood, and under the influence of countless elemental turbulence, it swept in all directions. There's still a little guy up there. Betty let out a crisp laugh. Han Jin wouldn't give his opponent time to prepare, and Caroline wouldn't wait for Han Jin to recover either. Her body suddenly shot into the air, drawing a long arc in the air as she fell towards Han Jin. No matter how distorted Caroline's face was, her gliding movements in the air were extremely beautiful. Han Jin started to make mistakes, and so did Edwina. If she had seen the battle clearly and heard Betty's warning, she wouldn't have targeted Betty. Actually, Han Jin and Edwina also had a chance of winning. They could have focused all their strength on killing Betty before she released her innate talent. Unfortunately, they missed the opportunity. Seeing that her attacks were ineffective, Edwina simply stood up. Her hands moved like butterflies as she drew her longbow, and arrow after arrow shot out. Edwina attacked with all her strength, and her shooting speed was extremely fast. Before the first arrow had even reached its target, the ninth arrow had already left the bow. Moreover, all of her arrows were magic arrows. The 9 arrows pierced through the air, forming an extremely long beam of light of different colors. One end of the beam was connected to the top of the hill, while the other end was connected to the bottom of the hill. The 9 arrows completely locked down Betty's space of movement. Betty wasn't afraid at all, and she slapped her palm towards Caroline from afar. Edwina only saw a blur before Caroline suddenly appeared where Betty was, and Betty appeared above Han Jin, reaching out her claws to attack Han Jin's chest. Although she was an expert in magic, she was also an excellent melee fighter. It was just that she couldn't compare to Caroline, who was of the same level. Caroline furrowed her brows slightly. In fact, she hated fighting alongside Betty. Back when they were facing Guevar's threat, Betty had also used this method to escape from Guevar's attack and put Caroline in danger. It was at that moment that the conflict between the two of them completely intensified. Betty's innate talent didn't have any restrictions. She could switch places with any soldier, yet she had chosen Caroline. Her sinister intentions were clear as day. After capturing Guevara, Caroline's first thought was to fight Betty to the death. However, Zagund was even angrier than her. In front of all the vampires, he gave Betty a few heavy slaps. They used to be equal in status, and there wasn't much of a difference in seniority. However, after that incident, Zagund made her the first madam, and the command of the vampires was completely given to her. It could be considered a blessing in disguise. However, with things having developed to this point, Caroline didn't have the time to think too much about it. At this moment, her eyes had already turned blood red, while the bone spikes on her hands and arms started to faintly tremble. With a sharp whistle, she swung her fist out to meet the first arrow. Han Jin, who was lying on the ground, suddenly sank down. Betty's lips curled into a sinister smile. A ball of blood slowly gathered in her palm, but she didn't attack. It was as if she was waiting for something. Han Jin had already realized that Betty had a special ability, so he rested for a moment before rising to the surface. However, as soon as he appeared, he was enveloped by a ball of blood. He couldn't help but fly more than 10 meters away. He landed heavily on the ground and rolled a few times before he could stabilize himself. This time, Han Jin got up much slower. Although he had the protection of spirit possession, there was a limit to the strength of his body. Since the start of the battle, he had already lost count of how many hits he had taken. Even though he had cast a few charm of spirit refreshment on himself, he still felt weak all over. His limbs and bones were in pain. Boom, boom. A series of explosions rang out in the air. Carolyn, who couldn't dodge, could only take Edwina's arrow dragon head-on. Although she had sufficient reaction speed, she was only able to take them head-on. Every explosion of elemental turbulence caused her a certain amount of damage. Han Jin took a deep breath. 1 stone. Betty chuckled and looked at Han Jin disapprovingly. Arouse up. Betty was still smiling. 1,000 heavy. The green light circling in the air had already returned to Han Jin's hand. The red light, however, hovered motionlessly in the air. As soon as the word heavy came out of Han Jin's mouth, a look of fear appeared on Betty's face. She screamed, and vines made of blood grew out of her body and soon covered her whole body. Han Jin suddenly understood. He spoke very steadily. If Betty didn't act strangely, he would release his master's ultimate skill after the word heavy. Around 1 second, Betty could sense the danger she would face in 1 second. Han Jin looked at Betty coldly. He checked in his mind. Suddenly, Betty glanced at the whip in his hand. That's right. After 2 tests, he had enough reason to trust his own judgment. However, the spell had already been activated. He couldn't stop. When Caroline had already taken Edwina's arrow dragon, Han Jin immediately released his ultimate skill. Wave, a white light soared into the sky and hit the red light hovering in the air. With a deafening boom, countless sword shadows shot down like raindrops. Rows, patches, and clusters of sword shadows were everywhere. The trees, bushes, and shrubs within 100 meters all collapsed at the same time. Some even shattered into pieces. Every sword shadow that landed on the ground would send dirt and sand flying into the air. Chapter 222. After panting for a while, Han Jin struggled to get up. He hadn't refined the black crystal thread yet, and it might lose its effect at any moment. He had to get rid of this last threat. Betty was still struggling on the ground. Although her body had been tied up like a rice dumpling, she still had room to move. She rolled around for a while, and then moved like a fish, kicking sand and stones in all directions. Han Jin originally wanted to kill Betty with the green aura in his hand, but seeing the situation, he immediately changed his mind. His body was very weak right now, and if he was kicked, the consequences would be unimaginable. Are you tired? Han Jin smiled gloatingly. Betty suddenly stopped struggling and turned her head to look at Han Jin. Her expression kept changing, and after a while, she said faintly, I admit defeat. I beg you, don't kill me. I'm not the one who wants to kill you. You're the one who wants to kill me. Han Jin said as he slowly walked to the side. However, his steps were very difficult and his body was swaying. It's that bitch who forced me to come. I don't have any grudges with you, so why would I kill you? Betty looked very uneasy. This is all a misunderstanding. What good will it do you to kill me? Han Jin walked in front of Edwina and squatted down with difficulty. He grabbed Edwina's wrist and listened carefully for a moment. He let out a long sigh, and his tone suddenly became cold. What good will it do me to not kill you? Edwina's heartbeat was very weak. If it was only Caroline's penetrating wound, he could still save Edwina's life. However, Edwina had also taken a heavy blow from Caroline. Her organs had been shaken to the point of shifting, and who knew how many of her blood vessels had been broken. Even if he had a lot of origin energy, he might not be able to save Edwina, let alone now. That's your elf, right? Betty begged. I will do better than her. I'm willing to be your slave, really. If you don't believe me, I can sign a contract with you. Contract? Han Jin slowly stood up. In fact, he did not believe Betty at all, and he could not let her go because she was a very insidious enemy. During the battle, he had already sensed that Betty had ulterior motives. She was deliberately not attacking to exhaust her companion's combat strength. Even a fool wouldn't trust such a person. Yes, after signing the contract, I will be your slave. I will only belong to you forever, and Betty blushed and shrank back as if she was very shy. Betty's dress had long been torn to shreds by Han Jin's thousand-layered waves, and after being tormented for so long, she was practically naked now. Although her hair had turned into a bird's nest and her face and body were covered in dirt, her figure was still top-notch. Her curves were soft and slender, big where they should be and curvy where they should be. There was nothing strange about this. If she only had strength and no beauty, she would not have been able to become Zagun's wife. Han Jin closed his eyes and adjusted his breath for a moment, then slowly opened his eyes. How do we sign the contract? It's very simple. You put your hand on my forehead, and I will chant the incantation, and then you will kill me? Betty suddenly became nervous. A ball of flame appeared in Han Jin's palm, and then it slowly floated forward. The flame was very small, about the size of a fingernail, and it looked like it could be extinguished by a gust of wind. No, sign the contract. This is my contract, Han Jin said expressionlessly. Betty turned over and used her head to push against the ground. After struggling for a long time, she finally stood up, but the speed of the flame was extremely slow. When Betty stood up, the flame was still 7 or 8 meters away from her. This is not a contract. You want to kill me, Betty screamed. It is a contract. Han Jin was still expressionless. Betty squatted down and suddenly shot out like a cannonball, using her body as a weapon, straight toward Han Jin. Fortunately, the distance between them was more than 30 meters, and Betty's body was tightly tied up. Although she could still bend her knees, it would take a long time for her to do so, which made it very obvious. Han Jin suddenly became vigilant. Seeing the human cannonball shooting toward him, Han Jin hurriedly retreated to the side, but his body could not keep up with his brain. Betty flew past his body, and the two of them instantly collided. As a result, Han Jin could not help but spin twice and fell on his back. The green light in his hand was also thrown far away. Boom! Betty crashed into something, and there was a loud noise. Han Jin did not dare to rest, and he quickly got up. His movements were very awkward, and when he turned to look at Betty, Han Jin could not help but be stunned. Betty crashed into the mountain root. He did not know if there was a hole there, or if Betty's momentum was too strong, but most of her body was gone, and only 2 legs and half of her calves were left swaying there. Han Jin staggered over, picked up his flying sword, and then staggered toward Betty. Betty's calves and legs swayed even more violently, but most of her body was stuck in the ground, and she was tied up tightly. No matter how hard she tried, she could not break free. You are very interesting, Han Jin said softly. I'm a little reluctant to kill you. Betty paused for a moment, and then began to struggle again, and she even let out a faint whimper. Han Jin narrowed his eyes and focused on reciting the mantra of the 3 true flames, and there was a flash of light in his palm. Han Jin smiled bitterly. He should immediately adjust his breathing, and it would not take long. 2 hours of meditation would be enough to recover some of his vital energy. However, perhaps in the next moment, his immortal binding rope would lose its effect, and then the one who would die would be him. Aren't you very good at guessing? Why didn't you guess your fate? Han Jin patted Betty's foot with the cyan dagger. I'll give you another chance. Guess if I should chop off your left foot first, or your right foot first. Betty struggled even more violently. Han Jin raised the cyan dagger and slashed down with all his strength, and then used the last of his strength and slashed 12 times in one breath. Betty's muscles and bones were very tough. After 12 slashes, only a few wounds were left, and he was unable to cut off any of her legs. Instead, he was so tired that he could not straighten his back. Han Jin sat down on the ground, and he felt extremely helpless. The idiom powerless was too apt for him. Without energy, he was a piece of trash, If he continued to slash like this, who knew how long it would take to completely kill Betty? He might as well take the risk now. Han Jin simply lay on the ground and closed his eyes to adjust his breathing. If Betty escaped while he was adjusting his breathing, then he would die. If Betty could not escape, then Betty would definitely die. After a long while, Han Jin slowly opened his eyes. His first reaction was to look at Betty. Betty was still struggling there. He let out a sigh of relief, and with a flip of his right hand, a crystal ball appeared in his hand. Han Jin knocked on the crystal ball, and a gray smoke came out of the crystal ball. The gray smoke did not dissipate and gradually formed Harley's body. Master! Heavens! Harley looked at Han Jin's miserable state and immediately cried out. Do you have a way to deal with vampires? How can those low-level creatures be my opponent? Harley shouted. Don't talk nonsense. Han Jin pointed with his finger weakly. Kill her for me. A complete ghost spirit that had not absorbed many ghosts would definitely not be able to hurt Betty. However, he did not erase Harley's previous consciousness. Now it seemed that his decision was incomparably correct. Understood. Harley's body turned into a cloud of smoke and wrapped around Betty's struggling legs. When the two came into contact, Harley returned to his original form. Master, I feel that her spiritual power is very strong. You don't have a way. If she falls into a coma, trash. Han Jin waved his hand. Forget it. I don't need you. After saying that, Han Jin took out a wooden soldier talisman from his space ring and threw it out. After he broke through the Xian martial realm, these wooden soldier talismans were useless to him. He could deal with the weak ones by himself, but if they were a threat to him, hundreds of wooden soldier talismans would not be able to turn the situation around. He originally planned to destroy the wooden soldier talismans to make room for other things, but now it seemed that fortunately he did not put it into action. A tall wooden soldier appeared out of thin air beside Han Jin. It raised its huge fist and punched Betty's calf, followed by the other fist. The wooden soldier did not know fatigue and was very strong. Of course, this was compared to ordinary people. With the strength of a wooden soldier, it was very difficult for it to pose a threat to high-grade professionals. However, to Betty, who was trapped underground, the wooden soldier was fatal. After dozens of punches, Betty's calves were forcefully broken. Under the command of Han Jin's telepathic thoughts, the wooden soldier cruelly tore off the broken legs. The blood vessels and ligaments were also torn apart. Blood spurted out like a fountain, dyeing the ground red. Betty screamed crazily on the ground. Every time her broken legs moved, they would leave a trail of blood in the air. However, because she was bound by the black crystal threads, she couldn't even cast a transformation spell, let alone cast a spell. Han Jin threw the green sword to the ground. The wooden soldier bent down and picked up the green sword. Kneeling there, it began to randomly poke the inside of the hole. Gradually, Betty stopped screaming. Her legs hung limply at the entrance of the hole. It was unknown whether she had fainted or was pretending to be dead. However, this could not be hidden from Harley. The smoke he released was still wrapped around Betty's body. Master, it's done. Leave it to me. Harley cried out in surprise and joy. Han Jin waved his hand and stopped the wooden soldier from attacking. He lay down on his back. He had absolute trust in Harley. He could not judge the effect of the contract in this world because he did not understand it at all. However, he believed in his own Tao. A trace of sleepiness floated in Han Jin's mind. He could not keep his eyelids open. This battle of life and death had almost exhausted everything he had, including his vital energy, physical strength, and mental strength. He was now extremely weak, but he did not dare to sleep. Once he lost consciousness, his immortal binding rope would lose its effect. Han Jin's eyelids slowly closed, and then he opened them again. This repeated a few times. Finally, he could not control his tiredness and fell asleep. Chapter 2:23. After Han Jin fell into a coma, the flashing brilliance of the black crystal thread dimmed, but Harley had completely controlled Betty. Betty's body could be seen withering little by little with the naked eye. A gust of cold wind blew, and Betty suddenly struggled out of the cave. She looked around suspiciously, then opened her mouth and let out an ear-piercing roar. A circle of faint gray smoke, with Betty as the center, swept in all directions. A figure appeared in the air. It was Jocelyn. She was still holding a dagger in her hand. She stared blankly at Betty. Madam. Betty had now become dry and thin, but there was not much change between her eyebrows. Her previous appearance could still be vaguely recognized. Betty suddenly walked towards Jocelyn. Her legs had been cut off, leaving only 2 thighs. She looked like a dwarf, and the way she moved while leaning on her thighs was very strange and terrifying. Madam, Jocelyn could not help but take a few steps back. Betty's hands pushed against the ground, and she suddenly jumped up and pounced straight at Jocelyn. Jocelyn was so scared that she broke out in a cold sweat. She also forgot to assassinate Han Jin and retreated as fast as she could. Betty missed and lay on the ground like a frog, but she did not give up. Her pupils gradually turned blood red, and she stared at Jocelyn. She pushed against the ground with both hands and pounced again. Jocelyn was not a good thief. She was good at another kind of martial arts. Seeing Betty's appearance becoming more and more ferocious, she was shocked and scared. She reluctantly mustered up the courage and stabbed the dagger in her hand straight at Betty's chest. Poof! Jocelyn's attack hit the target. The dagger pierced deeply into Betty's heart, but the force of Betty's forward charge made Jocelyn somersault. The next moment, Betty was riding on Jocelyn's body and tightly clutching Jocelyn's throat with both hands. Jocelyn's eyes rolled back. The dagger in her right hand stabbed continuously, leaving 7 or 8 bloody holes on Betty's body. But Betty seemed to feel nothing and pinched even harder. Leave one alive, Han Jin said in a low voice. He was awakened by the sound of fighting. Betty lowered her face and roared against the tip of Jocelyn's nose. Jocelyn's face, which had turned red due to her lack of breathing, suddenly turned pale. Blood flowed out of the corners of her mouth, nostrils, eyes, and ears. Jocelyn struggled desperately a few times before she stopped moving. Asterisk, 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 the Red Vanguards only had 6 members. Hayden and Charles had died in battle, and Edwina had stopped breathing on the way back. This blow was too cruel. It could even be said that the famous Red Vanguards in isolated Cliff City would never be able to return to their former glory. Gibran originally held the principle of quality over quantity, and every member was a high-level professional. Now that half of the platform had collapsed, where could he find like-minded and trustworthy high-level mercenaries? Moreover, he was not in the mood to recruit people. Han Jin lay quietly on the bed. The relaxed smile that always hung on his face had long disappeared. It was replaced by a kind of suppressed solemnity. Not long after Harley subdued Jocelyn, Guevara and Gibran finally arrived with their men. Jocelyn's little trick could not escape Gibran's eyes. In the whole of isolated Cliff City, Gibran was undoubtedly the best thief. Unfortunately, the battle was over, and they could not do anything. Han Jin had been reflecting on himself. Back then, his 1 stone raises 1,000 waves had shown its power. Then, he set up the 8 gates Heavenlock Matrix and killed countless attacking mercenaries. When he returned to isolated Cliff City, all he heard were praises, and all he saw were expressions of awe. After a long time, he also felt that he was very powerful, even great. Except for super-level masters like Guevara, there was no one in the world who could match him. He liked to use powerful and beautiful spells to kill his opponents, just like how he killed the mage from Cold Shadow City in the duel arena. Not only was it satisfying, but it also created a kind of deterrence for all the bystanders. See, no one can doubt my strength. Therefore, after he discovered Hayden's abnormality, he still decided to continue chasing him. He was not afraid of any challenge, so he did not hesitate to use his vital energy and use his flying sword. That was the stupidest sword move, and also the most painful one when he thought about it. If he had saved his vital energy, he could have done a lot of things, and he would not have been beaten to the point where he could not fight back. Han Jin wanted to laugh at himself. In the past, when he did something that made him proud and then ran to his master to show off, his master never praised him. Instead, his master would lecture him with a worried tone. At that time, he thought that his master's requirements were too harsh. Now, he finally understood that some things could not be learned by killing a few little monsters. If he did something right, he would think that he was extraordinary. If he did something wrong, he would use his youth to excuse himself. How childish, how shallow, and ridiculous. Yes, the enemy's conspiracy was not something he could control, but he had many choices, and he could have done better. For example, after discovering Hayden's abnormality, he could have immediately subdued Hayden and regrouped with the others. Even if he was surrounded, he could have chosen other ways to fight, instead of using his flying sword to try and kill his opponent instantly. His master had said many times that the so-called masters did not refer to those who could destroy their opponents with a single blow. They were those who could always choose the right spell at the right time. Only then could they be called masters. If he could go back in time, he was confident that he could protect himself and Edwina. Unfortunately, he could not turn back time. Moreover, he was biting off more than he could chew. Now that he could release the 3 true flames, he shifted his interest to the Red Lotus Hellfire. In the past few days, he had been absorbing fire element magic crystals in an attempt to create Red Lotus Hellfire charm. However, the Red Lotus Hellfire required too much fire element. Before the accident, he had only completed a few % of the charm. According to his current speed, it would take him about a few hundred days to succeed. However, he had always believed that his choice was correct. He had even imagined the shocking scene when he released the Red Lotus Hellfire. How laughable! If he had a few 3 true flames charms, even one, he would have been able to turn the situation around. Actually, Hanjin was someone who was brave enough to take responsibility. He did not find excuses to comfort himself. Indeed, he did not understand his opponent, which was why he kept making mistakes. However, his opponent did not understand him either. This was not an excuse. As he kept blaming himself, Hanjin's breathing gradually became heavier. Sunir, who was lying on the edge of the bed, was awakened. Her eyes swept over Hanjin's body. "Raphael, are you in a lot of pain?" "I'm fine," Hanjin said softly. "You don't have to accompany me. Go and accompany Julia. Gibran is with her." Sunir sighed softly. She took out a handkerchief and gently wiped the sweat off Hanjin's forehead. Their gazes met. Hanjin suddenly felt that he could no longer see through Sunir. When he first met Sunir, he thought that Sunir was a strong and capable elf. However, after spending some time with her, he felt that Sunir was actually very weak. Now, Edwina's death must have been a huge blow to Sunir, but she did not shed a single tear. Perhaps during the war started by the Silver Pegasus army, Sunir had learned to rather bleed than cry. "You don't blame me?" Hanjin said slowly. "Blame you?" Sunir was stunned. "Blame you for what?" "If I didn't decide to chase after her, Edwina wouldn't have." "You're right." Sunir slowly shook her head. Guevara said that if Caroline and Betty realized that something was wrong, they could use polymorph to escape. If they hid in the dark, we would only lose more people. We had to get rid of them as soon as possible. Hanjin smiled bitterly. Guevara's words made sense, but the problem was that he didn't know who his opponent was when he decided to chase after them. Therefore, Sunir's words had nothing to do with him. "Don't think too much. You should rest now," Sunir said softly. "Where's Stillberg?" Hanjin suddenly asked. "Do you need him for something?" "Yes." Hanjin nodded. Sunir didn't want Hanjin to do anything else and just focus on recovering. However, when she saw Hanjin's determined expression, she hesitated for a moment and stood up. "Then wait." She turned and quickly left the room. Not long after, Sunir and Stillberg walked in one after another. Stillberg looked very emotional, and his eyes were red, but he didn't make any big movements. He stood there and said in a low voice, "Young master, you were looking for me? Sasu is back, right?" Hanjin asked. After such a big thing happened, how could Sasu be in the mood to study alchemy in Cold Shadow City? He must be back. "Yes, they're all in front. Call him out alone and teach him my magic." Hanjin paused. "Tell him not to worry about anything and just focus on cultivating." "Young master," Stillberg opened his mouth in shock. Go! Stillberg was stunned for a moment before he turned and left the room. Raphael, have you really decided to teach Sassu your magic? Sunir hurriedly asked. Not only Sassu, but all of you will have to learn from me in the future, Han Jin said slowly. Tragedy. Once is enough. He didn't expect the others to have great achievements in Tao. There are many things that couldn't be explained with the language of this world, but at least they could use some of the talismans he made. If Edwina had an Earthmeld talisman and could use it herself, she wouldn't have died. As for letting Sassu cultivate first, it was because he was worried that there would be a conflict between Tao and magic. I can learn it too. Yes, Han Jin sighed softly. Sunir, you have the Earth elemental magic crystals, right? Give me some. Speaking of this, he realized another weakness of his. His personality tended to go to extremes, and he had to correct it too much. Yelena's magic sentries didn't work in front of Mantico, and they were almost ambushed. It was his 8 gates Heavenlock matrix that made the most difference. In the end, not only did he not believe in Yelena's power, but he also didn't believe in anyone else. He only wanted to become stronger, and he hadn't fulfilled his promise to give Morrisons the faked Earth corpse. He thought that he would be able to stand in front of them if they were in danger. Now it seemed that he was wrong. Enemies wouldn't just stand in front of them like idiots. Sunir stared blankly at Han Jin. She felt that Han Jin seemed to have been greatly stimulated. Before, Han Jin's magic was taboo, and he would never talk to anyone about it. Even if someone asked, he would just smile and not answer. Now, he was suddenly going to teach it to someone else, and they were all going to learn it. It was hard to believe. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 224. In the blink of an eye, more than 10 days had passed, and the atmosphere in the encampment had finally calmed down. The dead couldn't be brought back to life, and those who were lucky enough to survive had to continue living. Only 2 people hadn't changed much. One was Han Jin, and the other was Julia. Han Jin didn't like to talk anymore, and he rarely smiled. Other than when he was cultivating, he would always sit there quietly, and no one knew what he was thinking. Everyone saw it and felt anxious. Leger and Sassu wanted to talk to Han Jin more than once, but they were all stopped by Guevara. Guevara himself had a similar experience. In fact, setbacks weren't scary. Smart people could learn a lot from setbacks, so he didn't want anyone to disturb Han Jin. On this day, Sunir finally persuaded Han Jin to go shopping with her. Guevara could watch over others, but he couldn't watch over Sunir. Sunir could accompany Han Jin all day, but he couldn't. The young couple was whispering to each other, so why did he have to come over and eavesdrop? He would suffer retribution. Sunir wanted to take a look at the Guild of Mercenaries first before going shopping, but the carriage had already arrived near the Guild of Mercenaries. Suddenly, they heard fierce shouts and waves of magic and combat energy. Han Jin was stunned. Sunir hurriedly lifted the curtain and looked outside. She smiled and said, "It should be the mercenaries from the guild catching spies." "Spies?" "Yes," Sunir replied. "The trouble caused by Cromwell and Caroline and Betty sneaking into isolated Cliff City has angered the trade union. Since 7 or 8 days ago, the Guild of Mercenaries has declared martial law in the city and is searching for spies sent by various lords. You didn't go out, so you didn't know." Winston and the others even went to help. Just as they were talking, the shouts were getting closer. Han Jin frowned, lifted the curtain, and went out. Saxon threw the horsewhip onto the shaft of the carriage and smiled at Han Jin. "My lord, I'll go help them." Han Jin nodded slightly. Saxon jumped down from the carriage and walked a dozen steps along the street. He leaned against the wall and waited quietly. 2 fully armed warriors, an archer, and a female magician were hurriedly retreating. Behind them were dozens of mercenaries who were hot on their heels. The female magician was very powerful. From time to time, she would turn around and cast firewalls and swamps. All of her spells were cast instantaneously. She did her best to slow down the pursuers. As for the archer, after running a few steps, he would turn around and shoot an arrow. The remaining 2 warriors hurriedly led the way. This city was full of mercenaries. It was too boring to be idle in the winter, and most mercenaries liked to meddle in other people's business. From time to time, there would be people jumping out to intercept them. However, the 2 warriors cooperated well and fought with no regard for their lives. They forced a bloody path out. With just a glance, Han Jin had determined that the female magician should be an 8th grade sage. The rest of them were between the 6th and 7th grade. However, the mercenaries from the Guild of Mercenaries didn't have any powerhouses to back them up. If it weren't for the official backing, it wouldn't take long for the mercenaries to turn around and kill them all. Saxon stood there motionless with his arms crossed. When the 2 warriors had already rushed past him, he suddenly attacked. He unsheathed his long sword in an instant and swept out a bright red flame towards the warrior on his left. Sunir drew her longbow and shot an arrow at the archer. In a chaotic battle, the archer's first priority was to be the first to kill the enemy archer. The archer's defense was far inferior to that of a warrior or a magician, so it was easier to kill him. On the other hand, if she let the archer go, even if there was a difference of a few grades, the archer's arrow would still be enough to pose a threat to her. The archer sensed the violent fluctuations of a fighting technique behind him and hurriedly turned around. Before he could see the situation clearly, an arrow had deeply penetrated his temple. The archer couldn't help but fall back, knocking the magician behind him. Saxon's chosen opponent also had a fighting technique, but it was for this reason that Saxon chose him. A bright red flame collided with a white fog. The fog was instantly dispersed, and the warrior let out a miserable cry as he retreated. In a close combat battle between a warrior with a fighting technique, the collision between the frozen fighting technique and the dragon flame fighting technique was the most dangerous. These 2 fighting techniques countered each other, and the one with the stronger fighting aura and the higher grade would instantly have the absolute advantage. There was no room for fancy moves. At that time, Cromwell also practiced the frozen fighting technique, but he suffered a loss at the hands of Saxon because his grade wasn't as high as Saxon's. Saxon let out a sinister laugh and pounced forward again. The warrior's frozen fighting technique was completely scattered, and in his panic he had no time to dodge. All he could do was raise his longsword and try to block Saxon's sword. With a bang, Saxon's longsword was blocked, but the bright red flame wasn't affected in the slightest. In an instant, it covered the upper body of the warrior. The warrior threw away his longsword and covered his head with both hands. He fell to the ground and rolled on the ground, screaming more and more miserably. His upper body was almost burnt, but his fighting aura had blocked most of the damage. He didn't die immediately. If he had known this would happen, he would have given up on resisting. The other warrior was shocked. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sunir drawing her longbow again. He hurriedly rushed to the side and used the battle axe in his hand to block his face. Sunir smiled and slightly lowered her left hand. The arrow pierced through the back of the warrior's foot and nailed his right foot to the ground. However, the warrior was rushing forward with all his might. He couldn't control his body at all. His right foot suddenly swung up, creating a mist of blood. Sunir's arrow was also forcibly torn in 2 by him. Amidst his screams, the warrior took another step forward. However, his torn foot could no longer support his weight. The warrior's right leg went limp, and he fell straight to the ground. The last remaining magician saw that the situation wasn't good. A magic scroll appeared in her hand, and her figure disappeared from the spot. She reappeared on a roof more than 40 meters away and floated into the air. Sunir drew her longbow, aimed at the back of the magician, and shot an arrow. The arrow hit the magic shield released by the magician. Another arrow followed, and the magic shield trembled violently. The magician didn't dare to fly up again. He landed on the ground and continued to run forward. This is a big fish. Saxon let out a hearty laugh and rushed forward. He then leaped into the air and landed on the top of the wall. Using the tip of his foot, he stomped on the top of the wall. The bricks on the top of the wall were smashed into smithereens, and a crescent-shaped hole appeared in the wall. Saxon then used the momentum to leap forward 20 meters and landed in the alley. chasing after the magician in a straight line. Han Jin and Sunir looked at each other and hurriedly followed behind. The magician panicked and didn't know where to go. She bumped into a factory that covered an area of about 600 meters. Many strong men were working hard to move sand and stones. Each of them had a shiny headband on their head, which was proof of their identity. They were slaves from Cold Shadow City. Hogan and a middle-aged man were standing in the middle of the factory, discussing something in a low voice. The female magician screamed, "Master Julian, save me! Save me!" The middle-aged man's expression changed slightly. He took a few steps back and made way for the magician to escape. However, he didn't seem to have any intention of saving the magician. "If you don't save me, you won't get better either." The female magician screamed again, "Idiot! Bitch!" The middle-aged man couldn't hold back anymore and cursed. Although Hogan would rather be a slave than fight Han Jin, he wasn't an idiot. Seeing that Han Jin and the others were chasing after the female magician, who seemed to have an ambiguous relationship with his companions, he immediately cast a magic shield on himself and took a few steps back. He coldly looked at the middle-aged man. At this moment, a rock came crashing down from the mound, heading straight for the female magician. The magician's reaction wasn't slow either. She raised her hand and released a large fireball, shattering the rock into pieces. While the pieces were still flying in the air, another huge rock came crashing down from above. This one was several times bigger than the previous one, weighing at least a few hundred kilograms. It was also incredibly fast. In the blink of an eye, it passed through the debris and smashed into the magic shield. With a bang, the magic shield was instantly shattered. The female magician screamed and retreated. The slaves, who seemed to be petrified, suddenly became violent and rushed from all directions with wooden sticks. The female magician waved her hand and released another big fireball. The slave closest to her was hit. He was wearing a headband, so he couldn't use any martial arts. He couldn't resist the attack of the big fireball with just his body. His body was almost hit in two, and he flew back in a strange posture. The tragic death of their companions didn't make the slaves cower. Their eyes were fiercer than the other, and they continued to rush forward. With a sharp whistle, a palm-sized rock shot out and hit the female magician's nose. Blood splattered. Before she could scream, the slave had already rushed over. A dozen wooden sticks all hit her legs. Without the protection of the magic shield, her body was even more vulnerable. She was knocked to the ground in an instant. The slaves rushed forward. Two wooden sticks crossed the female magician's neck. Her magic staff was kicked to the side, and a wooden stick was stabbed into the female magician's mouth. Her limbs were tightly stepped on by large feet. She couldn't move and couldn't even scream. The only thing she could do was to keep crying. "Julian, give me an explanation," Hogan said in a sinister voice. The middle-aged man smiled and retreated. Suddenly, he turned into a black bat and flapped his wings rapidly to fly into the sky. "Want to run?" Hogan snorted. A giant arrow, completely condensed from ice, suddenly appeared in the air and shot directly at the bat. With a flash of black light, Sunir hit the target first. The bat was deflected to the side, and Hogan's ice arrow only hit the bat's wings. However, the power was enough. The bat's wings were firmly locked by a block of ice, and its body fell rapidly. Seeing that all the fugitives were under control, Saxon put away his long sword. His gaze swept over the slaves. Not bad. He wasn't surprised by the strength of the slaves, but by their cooperation. Their cooperation was too good. Chapter 225. Han Jin's gaze fell on a mound of dirt. The one who had thrown the stone was a burly man about the same height as Morrison's, but his face was much fiercer than Morrison's. He had two fierce lines on his face, short and thick eyebrows, a wide nose, a big mouth, and thick lips. Although his lips looked silly, they were insignificant compared to his sharp gaze. The bat fell to the ground and returned to its human form, moaning in pain. Hogan raised his wand, and 4 icicles rose from the ground, freezing the middle-aged man's limbs. "Damn it, I told you that you had nothing better to do than to court me. Hogan cursed fiercely. You come here. Hanjin pointed at the burly man. The burly man hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked down the mound of dirt. The slaves around them all gathered around, keeping a distance of about 10 meters from the burly man, following him at a moderate pace. What do you want? Hogan was furious and hurriedly ran in front of Hanjin. Get back. Do you want to die? What's your name? Hanjin gently pushed Hogan to the side. He could see that the burly man had a lot of influence among the slaves. The burly man was silent and only looked at Hanjin quietly. Alexander, you'd better behave yourself. The Lord is asking you a question. Hogan yelled, then smiled at Hanjin. His name is Alexander, and he's very difficult to tame. If I didn't need him to command the slaves, I would have, you know him? What did he do before? Hanjin interrupted Hogan. He's the general of Cummins City. Hogan understood that this slave had piqued Hanjin's interest. Without waiting for Hanjin to continue asking, he explained in detail his ability is not bad. He used to give us a headache. If it wasn't for Cummins City's Lord Sang Ma being wary of him and deliberately leaving him in the lurch, we wouldn't have been able to annihilate his army. At this moment, a scream suddenly came from outside. No, more than a dozen girls were carrying buckets of hot water into the construction site. They noticed that something was wrong. When the girl in the lead saw Hanjin's face, she threw the pole to the ground and ran up to him. She grabbed Alexander's arm and said, "Are you crazy? He is our benefactor, our benefactor." Alexander's expression changed drastically. He carefully observed Hanjin for a moment, then slowly knelt down on one knee. Although the slaves behind him didn't know what was going on, they followed suit and knelt down. Hogan breathed a sigh of relief. At the same time, a strange feeling surfaced in his heart. Hanjin's grace to the slaves was built on his humiliation. Get up. Hanjin paused. Hogan, do you have a way to remove their halo of suppression? I can do that. Hogan hesitated. However, Master, they will die. Die. The wounds on the back of their heads will gradually rot. Master, I've told you before that there were people who wanted their slaves to regain their freedom. However, after removing the restraining bracelet, they won't be able to live for long. Only a small number of slaves can survive. You don't have to worry about that. I have a way. Hanjin pointed a few times and finally pointed at Alexander. You, and you come with me. The slaves selected by Hanjin walked out one by one and stood behind Alexander. Hogan, what are you doing here? Sunir asked. You don't know? Hogan smiled. We are building a house for Master. Sunir couldn't help but look at Hanjin. Hanjin asked curiously, How come I don't know? Who told you to do this? Master Guevara told us to do this. Hanjin looked around. The factory was very large, and it was close to the city center. Every inch of land here was very expensive. Where did Guevara get the money? Hogan knew what Hanjin was thinking and hurriedly said, It was the trade union who bought the land and gave it to Lord Guevara. But Lord Guevara showed me the title deed, and your name is written on it. Those guys are so generous. Saxon sighed with envy. Forget it. Let's go back first. Hanjin's gaze turned to the mercenaries from the Mercenary Association. I'll leave these two guys to you. Is that okay? Master, don't worry. The leader of the mercenaries smiled and waved his hand. The mercenaries behind him swarmed forward, pushed the slaves aside, and tied up the female magician. In the process of the pursuit, many of their companions were killed, so their methods were very rough. Anyway, no one cared whether they tortured the captives or not. As long as the captives were not tortured to death, it was fine. Hogan, you come with me. Hanjin said, Saxon, you stay here for a while. Okay, Saxon said with a smile. Logically speaking, Hanjin couldn't give orders to Saxon directly because Saxon was Winston's subordinate. However, everyone lived under the same roof for a long time, and their relationship became messy. When Gibran and Winston needed help, they often skipped Hanjin and went directly to Morrison's. It wasn't on purpose, but it was convenient. Hanjin was the same. Fortunately, Gibran and Winston weren't the kind of ambitious people who liked to scheme against each other. Otherwise, there would have been trouble. In fact, Gibran and Winston were fully capable of expanding their own mercenary team into a mercenary group. It wasn't that they couldn't, but that they didn't want to. Human nature was too complicated, and more people meant more trouble. If they recruited a few people who liked to stir up trouble, it could very well ruin the relationship between the brothers. Now that they were living together, it was lively, and they didn't have to guard against anything. They couldn't be happier, especially Winston, who loved this kind of life. Sunir's shopping plan ended prematurely, and Hanjin brought the slaves back to the camp. In the living room, Morrison's, Leger, and Winston were chatting about something. Hanjin strode in. Morrison's and the others were first attracted to Alexander. Leger smiled. Morrison's, did you see that? That guy looks even stronger than you. Morrison's looked Alexander up and down and said disapprovingly, I'm much prettier than him. Prettier? Please, Leger said very seriously. Can you not blaspheme that word? What do you mean? Morrison's looked at Leger from the corner of his eyes. He looked like he was about to start a fight if he didn't agree. Nothing. Leger was threatened, so he had to change his tone. As far as I know, the word prettier is used to describe people, right? Morrison's eyes widened in anger. He reached out to grab Leger, but Leger had already flipped over from his chair. Stop messing around, you two, Hanjin said calmly. Morrison's and Leger looked at each other and quieted down. They did it on purpose. In Morrison's words, when Hanjin pulled a long face, the air became heavy, so they tried to lighten the atmosphere and make Hanjin smile like before. However, they failed again. Hogan, you can start now, Hanjin said as he sat in the empty chair. Hogan walked behind Alexander and chanted a spell in a low voice. A moment later, two shiny crystal nails emerged from the back of Alexander's head. Bang! The headband loosened and fell to the ground with a crisp metallic sound. Hanjin's hand drew a few lines in the air. With a wave of his hand, the faintly discernible talisman turned into a ray of white light and hit Alexander. Alexander's body swayed. He slowly moved his neck, then his shoulders, as if he was savoring the strength he had lost and regained. Don't release combat aura for the next few days. It's not good for your injuries, Hanjin said slowly. Are you a knight or a swordsman? I'm a 10th grade knight of light, sir, Alexander replied in a low voice. Can you allow me to do something? Sure. Hanjin didn't ask what Alexander wanted to do. He agreed immediately. Alexander's gaze fell on Hogan. Sir, can you make this guy stop moving? Hogan, Hanjin said calmly. Hogan had a bad feeling. His expression was one of panic, but since Hanjin had spoken, he didn't dare to disobey. Alexander walked in front of Hogan and looked at him coldly. After a while, he slowly reached out his hand and slapped Hogan hard across the face. Hogan could surrender in exchange for Hanjin's forgiveness, but he, Alexander, couldn't forget his past hatred. From Cold Shadow City to isolated Cliff City, Hogan had treated the slaves like ants. He had killed countless soldiers and toyed with countless female slaves. He had to do something for the innocent. Hogan's entire body flew up and fell to the ground. His cheek was swollen and blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. Thank you, sir. Alexander knelt down on one knee. Please allow me to pledge my loyalty to you. Before the Grim Reaper takes my life, I, Alexander, will always be your most loyal warrior. Get up. Hanjin smiled. Hogan next. Alexander was someone who knew what was good for him. He was very satisfied with this. If Alexander wanted to kill him, he would definitely stop him. Whether it was now or in the future, Hogan's importance was irreplaceable. Yelena's research on Cold Shadow City's alchemy had reached a critical stage. In the future, when they fought against Cold Shadow City, they would have to rely on Hogan to understand their opponents. Master! Hogan crawled up and wailed loudly. If he were to release a single restraining hoop, he would be slapped in the face. It was fine if he didn't do this job, since he would be beaten to death sooner or later. There were still thousands of slaves outside. Don't worry. No one will hurt you again, Alexander said coldly. Alexander said coldly, you are the master's slave. I have the same responsibility to protect you. Hogan spat out a mouthful of bloody saliva and glared at Alexander. He wouldn't accept Alexander's kindness. If possible, he would freeze Alexander into a statue and smash him into pieces bit by bit. After all, he was an ice magician. It was too embarrassing to be slapped in front of so many people. Slaves also had dignity. Unfortunately, he realized it too late. "Hogan, didn't you hear me?" Han Jin asked. "Yes, master." Hogan's face fell again. He slowly moved behind Slave. He was really unwilling, but he couldn't disobey Han Jin's orders. Chapter 2:26. A black thin line was swimming in the white flame like a snake. Han Jin sat on the bed and stared at the thin line without blinking. The black crystal thread would be the most effective weapon against the powerhouse. Even Guevara, who was at his peak, was completely restrained by the black crystal thread, let alone the others. However, in the past few days, he had been absorbing the energy of the earth elemental magic crystals and only occasionally swallowed a fire elemental magic crystal. Moreover, making magic treasures required a long time of burning with the 3 true flames. Therefore, even today, his immortal binding rope was still far from complete. The color of the black crystal thread gradually changed. First, it became bright red. Then it slowly turned golden. Han Jin took a deep breath and sent out a few more balls of true fire. Then, his fingers quickly moved in the air. One talisman after another appeared in the air, and the black crystal thread seemed to have some kind of attractive force. Before Han Jin could do anything, the black crystal thread automatically sucked the talismans over. The white light bombarded the black crystal thread one after another, creating countless golden sparks. The scene was very dazzling. Beads of sweat appeared on Han Jin's forehead. It was about time. The fire elements that he had absorbed had all been used up. He didn't want to use his vital energy. It was easy to use the fire elements to condense the 3 true flames, but using his vital energy to release the 3 true flames would consume a lot of energy. Although vital energy wasn't a pure form of energy and could be recovered through breathing, it would still take a considerable amount of time. Ever since the last incident, Han Jin had been living in a state of tension and vigilance. He was always prepared to deal with any accidents. Even if he consumed a little bit of his vital energy, it would make him feel unsafe. However, no one really understood Han Jin, so no one helped him adjust his state of mind. He could only rely on himself to comprehend everything. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. Han Jin waved his hand, and the golden thread shot toward Han Jin with a whoosh. It then wrapped around Han Jin's right wrist. From afar, it looked like a golden bracelet. He couldn't put the black crystal thread into the space ring. The 3 true flames were too domineering. Once it entered the space ring, it would cut off the control of his divine sense. Last time, it almost burned the tree demon wood. He could only wait for a while. When the 3 true flames lacked the support of energy, it would naturally extinguish. Only then could he put the black crystal thread away. "Come in," Han Jin said. The door opened, and Guevara slowly walked in. He glanced at Han Jin and said, "I heard that you helped the Mercenary Association catch a vampire today." "Yes." "Why?" Han Jin was a little surprised. Guevara wouldn't come looking for him for such a small matter. He didn't want to go out these days, so Guevara handled all the external affairs by himself. He negotiated with the Chamber of Commerce Alliance, contacted the people sent by Lang Ning, and so on. In other words, Guevara was very busy now. It seems that I was right. Guevara slowly sat on the chair and pondered for a moment. Those vampires won't let you go. Although Zagund has always been in control of the vampires, this race is very xenophobic. They are cohesive and can be closely united. Even if Zagund thinks that now is not the time for revenge, there must be another voice among the vampires. They will come. Then let them come. Han Jin said faintly, "Even if they don't come, I will go find them." Guevara stared at Han Jin. After a while, he shook his head and said, "It's not good for you to be like this." "Me? What's wrong with me?" Han Jin was stunned. "You're too gloomy now," Guevara said softly. "Young people should have the vitality of young people. Don't be so lifeless. Actually, Falling down is not a big deal. What's scary is that you can't get up after falling down. I feel that I'm very good now. You are a very smart child. I believe you can understand what I mean. Guevara smiled. Forget it. Let's not talk about this anymore. I don't want people to think that I am too long-winded. I know. Hanjin was silent for a moment. Thank you. Thank you? I understand. You're reminding me that I should thank you, right? Guevara laughed. But I really have to thank you. I'm old, and I don't have any other wishes. My only goal is to get rid of Zaganide, Carolyn, and Betty so that I can seek justice for myself. Now that you've helped me get rid of 2 of them, I can finally heave a sigh of relief. This is great, this is great. This is what I should do. Even if I don't kill them, they will kill me. No matter what, you did it, Guevara said softly. What do you think? Tell me about it. Guevara's original intention was to let Hanjin figure it out himself. However, Hanjin's performance was somewhat worrying. Now, Guevara could not help but ask, experience? I was just lucky. From the beginning, Betty was trying to frame Caroline. She did not use her full strength at all. You said that she is a magician of the Blood Clan. However, I only saw her use one type of magic and a barrier. A magician can not only know 2 types of magic, right? Hanjin did not know how many times he had thought about that battle. He found many key points and understood many things. If she did not have evil intentions, I would have died long ago. Actually, in Zagun's camp, no matter if it is strength or scheming, Betty can be ranked second. Compared to her, Caroline is just a brainless idiot. However, she was always suppressed by Caroline. Therefore, she was very unhappy and wanted to kill Caroline. Guevara smiled. She was wrong. Caroline was able to suppress her because Zagund thought that Caroline was more suitable. Even if she could kill Caroline, Zagund would still support other vampires. He would never let Betty control the entire army. Why? Aren't they husband and wife? Hanjin asked in surprise. As I said earlier, vampires are very xenophobic. However, they are also very cohesive and can be very united. Zagund is not a vampire. Would he be assured to hand over such an army to a scheming and even treacherous vampire? Hanjin was silent. Let me give you an example. There is a door in front of us. We need to pay a heavy price to control that door. As long as Zagund gives the order, Caroline will immediately rush forward without any hesitation. However, Betty might be concerned about the strength of the Blood Race's army and use all kinds of excuses to delay the army's attack. Guevara said, if you were the Lord, who would you choose? Caroline. Hanjin was not pretentious. If it were any other lord, they could only choose Caroline. You said that they are husband and wife? Guevara smiled. Zagund can command the vampire army in the name of his husband. Betty can also command the other abyssal races in the name of her wife. Of course, if Zagund dies, Zagund can completely trust Caroline. However, Betty is an extremely ambitious person. I think Zagund knows this better than I do. Would he dare to trust Betty? Is there a need to make the relationship between husband and wife so complicated? Hanjin revealed a contemptuous smile. He had come into contact with many things, but it could not be said that he had a lot of experience. He still had a longing for love. Since they loved each other, they should trust each other. It was better not to love each other at all times. Other than the deepest secrets, he would not hold anything back from Sunir. He would not suspect anything, and he would not be vigilant. Therefore, he was very disdainful of the conflict between Zagund and the 2 vampires. You, Guevara shook his head. You are not in that position. Sooner or later, you'll understand. Understand what? Guard against my wife? Hanjin said softly. I won't. Guevara did not say anything. He only looked at Hanjin with a smile. Definitely not, Hanjin added. He is still too young. Guevara sighed in his heart. He was different from Hanjin. Guevara understood this world too well. He knew everything that others knew, and he knew everything that others did not know. Sunir had the mark of God. According to the rules of the elves, she had to marry another elf who had the mark of God. This was because the elves hoped for the birth of an unparalleled powerhouse who could lead the entire race out of their current predicament and restore their glory. When the Wild Willow City found out about this one day, trouble would follow. Sunir could ignore this rule and choose the one she truly liked. However, the elders who followed the rules would not tolerate Sunir's betrayal. Their reaction was worrying. When it came to upholding justice, the elves would become very tenacious. Gavara had experienced it firsthand. They were not afraid of sacrificing themselves. Even if they ran out of ammunition and food, they would not give up. In the past, he was defeated by such an elven army. Of course, the so-called justice was only what the elves thought was justice. When there was conflict, there would definitely be bloodshed. Seeing their friends and companions fall under the butcher's knife, Hanjin and Sunir would not change at all. Would they still like each other as much as they did now? Would there not be any estrangement between them? Gavara accidentally heard Julia and Sunir whispering to each other. Julia was worried about Sunir's future. She had been out for a long time, so she did not see the boundaries between races very clearly. Moreover, she had also fallen in love with a human, so she could understand Sunir's feelings. However, most elves could not. Sunir's attitude was very optimistic. She firmly believed that Hanjin could solve all the problems. She even used Hanjin's rapid improvement in the past year as a reason. That little elf, she was happy for Hanjin's every improvement. It seemed that she had a premonition of the pressure that they would face in the future. Yes, if Hanjin had overwhelming power, he could indeed make the entire Wild Willow City bow their heads and make the elders collectively lose their voices and agree to the truth. However, this was only a compromise that they had no choice but to choose. Compromising and resolving conflicts were two completely different things. The former was full of oppression, while the latter was a happy ending for everyone. It could also be said that even if the elders of Wild Willow City compromised, there would still be some dirty things brewing in the future. Young people always had clear boundaries. Love was love, and there was no room for other impurities. However, for an experienced elder like Gavara, this word was worthless. In fact, he now preferred another girl. However, he had never tried to influence Hanjin. Although he did not know Hanjin's background, he understood Hanjin's character. If he really did that, Hanjin would never forgive him. They might even become enemies, even if he did it for the sake of Hanjin. Actually, I'm not worried about the vampires in Zagun's hands. Gavara controlled his thoughts and then changed the topic. It was not the time to talk about this to Hanjin. Even if he did, Hanjin would not understand. The only thing he could do was to hurry back and help Lang Ning defeat the Beatman's army. If Hanjin really became the Lord of Black Raven City and the Bite Man, then the elders of Wild Willow City would have to think twice. Did they really want to provoke the wrath of a lord? Although rules were important, some things were even more important than rules. When facing a lord who had conquered 2 provinces, they did not dare to be careless. Then what are you worried about? Hanjin asked. I'm afraid of alarming the old guys of the Blood Clan in the Abyss, Gavara said slowly. Speaking of which, Caroline and Betty are their descendants, and they are the best of the best. Now that they have died in your hands, it's inevitable that some of them will want to come out and take action. If only Gale is alone. I'm really worried. Hanjin's expression became serious. He did not know how powerful Majordomo Gale was, but if he could earn Gavara's respect, then he must not be weak. Now that he heard Gavara say that Gale might not be able to handle it alone and would need 2 people to work together, this kind of threat made him very nervous. You don't have to worry about this kind of thing. I will arrange it properly. Gavara noticed the change in Hanjin's expression. The road to the Abyss is not easy to travel. This trip will take at least half a year, which is enough time for us to prepare. Hanjin didn't say anything. Do you know what the scariest thing about vampires is? Gavara asked. It's their innate talent. You're right. Gavara nodded and said, Carolyn's innate talent is the most useless. Of course, if her strength were to increase a little more, her innate talent would make countless powerhouses fear her. It's a pity that she's too weak. And Betty's innate talent is very troublesome. In the past, I often suffered under her hands. If it wasn't for her, how could Zagund have trapped me? The old men of the Blood Clan that you mentioned just now, do you know their innate talent? I don't know. Guevara smiled. That's why I said that we must be prepared. Han Jin's heart sank. It seemed that Guevara did not have much confidence. The life of a vampire is as long as that of an elf. When I was young, I was always jealous of them. Guevara smiled. Now I have thought it through. 100 years of life, is it not enough? I have loved, I have hated, I have struggled, I have been dispirited, I have succeeded, and I have failed. These are already extremely tiring. Death is actually kind of release. I'm really curious. What fun do those who have lived for thousands of years still have? And some things do not get stronger the longer they live. Those old vampires hide in the dark and sleep all day long. Some sleep for decades, even hundreds of years. Is this called enjoying life? I don't believe that they can reach a higher level in their sleep. Han Jin opened his mouth. He wanted to say something, but he did not say it. With Guevara's experience, he believed that death was a kind of release. Han Jin could understand, but he knew that no matter what happened, no life could resist the temptation of eternity. And what Han Jin pursued with all his might was eternity. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 227. A girl with delicate features walked into Han Jin's room. She carried a wooden tub filled with hot water and placed it on the floor with much effort. She then waited by the side. Just leave it here. Han Jin raised his head and looked at the girl. The girl bent down as if she didn't understand Han Jin's words. She slowly squatted down, hesitated for a moment, and then reached out to hold Han Jin's leg. Han Jin was thinking about some important issues when the girl grabbed his leg, and his thoughts were forcefully interrupted. Han Jin couldn't help but frown. I have my own hands. You can leave. Sunir, who was fiddling with a vase, walked over and gently nudged Han Jin. Miriam, I'll be here. It's getting late. You should go back and rest. The girl stood up, took a look at Sunir, and bowed deeply to her. Then she slowly left the room. Miriam was the flower girl. For some reason, she didn't return home after recovering from her injuries. Instead, she stayed in the outpost. Although this was a place where men outnumbered women, Han Jin, Morrison's, Winston, and the others were mostly men, no one bullied her or made things difficult for her. Her initial uneasiness quickly disappeared. However, Miriam was a very practical girl. She didn't want to eat for free, as that would make her look down on others. So, she had been looking for something to do. She didn't need to interfere with chores, and the orphans that Winston had taken in didn't want to eat for free either. In the end, she turned her attention to Han Jin. In truth, Miriam had her own schemes. She didn't dare to interact with others for fear of being taken advantage of. Everyone knew about the relationship between Han Jin and Sunir. Compared to the beautiful Sunir, she knew that she was very ordinary. Naturally, she didn't have much to worry about. Sunir looked at Miriam's back and shook her head slightly. Poor girl. Her name isn't good. Name? In the ancient language of the elves, Miriam means the ocean of suffering. Sunir sighed. Then, what does your name mean in ancient Elvish? I won't tell you. Sunir tilted her head and smiled. Then, her gaze landed on the wooden basin. Young master, do you really need me to serve you? How would I dare? Han Jin chuckled. Otherwise, all the elves would come after me. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Sunir looked up and said, Come in. Chipango and Howlister walked in one after another. My lord, Sunir saw Chipango glance at her for a moment before he stopped talking. She understood what Chipango meant and smiled. You guys talk, I'll go take a walk. After Sunir's figure disappeared through the door, Han Jin said faintly, Don't do such petty things in front of Sunir in the future, understand? Yes, my lord. Chipango lowered his head in fear. My lord, I think Chipango is right. There are many things that we can only tell you, Howlister said with a smile. Han Jin looked at Howlister. Howlister maintained a neutral expression and lowered his head with a smile. "My lord," Chipango hurriedly said, "in the past few days, some mercenaries have been saying strange things about you. I think they have ulterior motives." "Oh, what did they say about me?" "They said terrible things," Chipango said in a low voice. "Don't worry. They said that a powerful person with the power to slay a dragon was injured by 2 vampires and couldn't even protect his companion. This is inexplicable. They also said that you're either a liar or deliberately trying to harm your companion." Hanjin was silent. His eyes flickered as if he was thinking about something. After a while, he asked, "Who said that?" "The Dawn Mercenary Team." "Dawn Mercenary Team?" Hanjin felt that this name was familiar. "My lord, have you forgotten? When we first returned to isolated Cliff City, we ran into Winston and the Dawn Mercenary Team. We helped Winston and scared the Dawn Mercenary Team away." "So it's them," Hanjin muttered. "But most of the mercenaries still trust you," Hollister interrupted. Hollister interjected, "As long as the Dawn Mercenary Band appears in public, they'll try to slander you. But they can't get any response from other mercenaries." "Ha! There was one time when they ran into the Dragon Singer Mercenary Band and almost got into a fight." "You mean the Dawn Mercenary Team is hostile to me?" "Yes, my lord." "Do you know why?" "No." Hal Lister shook his head. "Most of the mercenaries know that Chipango and I are your men. We have no way of contacting the Dawn Mercenary crew. We only recruited a dozen or so mercenaries, and half of them are useless. Relying on them to gather information is too much. The beginning is always difficult. The situation will slowly improve." Hanjin sighed. "We understand, my lord." Hal Lister smiled. "But I found something very interesting. The Dawn Mercenary Team used to be very friendly. After you defeated the magicians from Cold Shadow City, they tried to get in touch with Sasu and Morrison's. To be precise, they suddenly changed 7 or 8 days ago. The attack on you gave them a good excuse to attack." 7 or 8 days ago? "Yes." Hal Lister thought for a moment. "There must be a reason. I'm trying to find out who the Dawn Mercenary Team contacted in those days. I believe that we will soon find out what they want to do." Hanjin paused. Chipango and Hal Lister couldn't have expanded the scope of their investigation so far. It sounded like they were bragging. Chipango saw Hanjin's confusion and smiled. "My lord, Hal Lister and the vice president of the Mercenary Association, Gustav, hooked up with his mistress. Gustav doesn't have a good relationship with his wife. He doesn't return home all year round and always works at his mistress' house. Therefore, we know a lot of things." "Hooked up? That's a terrible word." Hal Lister smiled bitterly. "Can't you use a more elegant word? Gustav's mistress?" Hanjin raised his eyebrows and said in a low voice, "Don't cause trouble for me. My lord, I know what to do." Hal Lister put on a serious expression. "Among the vice presidents, Juventus has the best relationship with us, and Gustav has the coldest relationship with us. Whether you want to continue developing an isolated Cliff City or not, you have to be careful of this person. Even so, you can't target Gustav. If this matter gets out, what do you think the people from the Mercenary Association will think?" "I don't know what others will think, but Vice President Juventus will be very happy. They have a feud." Hanjin was stunned. "Yes, they have even tried to undermine each other. However, Vice President Juventus is in charge of law and order, while Vice President Gustav is in charge of intelligence. Juventus's power is far less than Gustav's, so he often suffers losses." Hal Lister smiled. "And do you still remember that black mission?" "Of course. Master Yelena's identity was announced by Winston at the Mercenary Conference. If Dwight Steele and the others didn't know about Master Yelena's identity, it would still be reasonable. But does Gustav really not know anything? Lord Forza of Fado City actually wanted to exchange 3 dragon crystals for the life of a young girl. Did he not think about why?" Hal Lister said slowly, "My lord, the entire isolated Cliff City has been fooled. I feel that there is something fishy about this." Hanjin pondered for a moment and said, "Go on." "My lord, on the surface, Gustav has no reason to betray the Mercenary Association. But you should know that Forza is a powerful lord, and he can promise a lot of things. At least, he can leave a way out for Gustav. Being a city lord within the sphere of influence of Fado City is much better than being a vice president here, isn't it? Hollister said, also, you are a big flag raised by the Chamber of Commerce Alliance and the Mercenary Association. Now that someone is secretly slandering you, what should they do? I have talked to Vice President Juventus about this. He was very angry, but Gustav didn't care. This is enough to explain the problem. Han Jin listened quietly and digested the information. After a while, he asked, is there anything else? Seeing Han Jin change the topic, Hollister knew that Han Jin had acquiesced to his actions. He thought for a moment and smiled. My lord, I have contacted the army from Black Raven City. Although you were the one who got the magic crystal cannons, your influence in the army is far less than Leger's. At least, they came to visit Leger, but this is not something you can interfere with, Han Jin interrupted Hollister. Yes, my lord. Hollister paused. But I haven't finished yet. Later, I talked to Leger, and I found that he doesn't take power seriously. If Han Jin slammed the table and said coldly, who told you to talk to him? Do you think you're the smartest, and everyone else is a fool? Do you think Leger can't guess your intentions? How can you be sure that Leger didn't say those words to you on purpose? Hollister was stunned. He had never seen Han Jin angry. He lowered his head and didn't dare to argue. Don't meddle in things you shouldn't meddle in. Han Jin's face was frighteningly dark. Leger is my friend now, and I hope he will always be. If you dare to act on your own again, don't blame me. Understood, my lord. Is there anything else? This, my lord, your slave, needs to be disciplined, Hollister said timidly. You mean Hogan? What about him? He has a lot of bad habits, Hollister said. Just this evening, he almost got into a fight with Alexander. Because of what? Hogan wanted to find 2 female slaves to serve him, but Alexander didn't let him. Then they got into a fight. I understand. Han Jin waved his hand. Hogan was his slave, but when he was outside, he always acted like an ice magician. In Han Jin's native language, Hogan's homonym was the root of his troubles. In fact, Hogan was indeed annoying, but Han Jin had no choice but to use him. Hollister was right. He should be disciplined. Chapter 228. Tim was furious. Even though the cold wind blew like a sharp blade, it could not extinguish the anger in his heart. He had been flying for a long time, but he did not feel tired at all. On the contrary, his blood was getting hotter and hotter. That was the power of revenge. Tim could not remember his parents. It was Madame Betty who adopted him and taught him many fighting skills. He liked Madame Betty, although he knew it was a kind of love mixed with Oedipus. And although he knew it was wrong, he still could not control himself. He had even thought of assassinating Zagund more than once. However, he knew that the difference in strength between him and Zagund was too big, so he could only hide this impulse in the bottom of his heart. Madame Betty said that he was too hot-tempered and could not do big things. He swore to change, but when he heard that Madame Betty was killed, everything went completely out of control. Zagund, that coward, used to laugh at Dismark and call him a coward. In fact, he was the same, an extremely shameless guy. He did not dare to avenge his wife, and only shed a few drops of fake tears. He even said that he would turn grief into strength. Go to hell. Thinking of Zagund, Tim became even angrier. Zagund's tricks could not be hidden from him. As soon as Madame Betty died, Zagund immediately mixed up with that slut named Lindsay and even sent Madame Betty's child back to the abyss to deliver a letter. Trash. Bullshit. Zagund only wanted to completely integrate the vampire army. He was worried that his own son would get in the way, so he kicked him back to the abyss. How despicable, how heartless. Just when Tim was about to bite something, a scream suddenly came from the front. That was a warning signal. Tim quickly flapped his wings and flew to the front of the team. 2 human-shaped black spots appeared in the sky, and they were getting bigger and bigger. Tim's eyesight was very good, and he quickly recognized that they were 2 gargoyles. The gargoyles also saw the cloud-like vampires and hurriedly rose into the sky. Tim screamed, and a dozen bats left the team and approached the gargoyles. The gargoyles, however, did not dare to fight with the vampires. They continued to rise into the sky and then flew straight to the north. The bats followed the gargoyle until it became smaller and smaller and disappeared into the horizon. Only then did they turn around and chase after the group. Hearing his subordinate's report, Tim breathed a sigh of relief. He had only brought his own direct subordinates. If Isolated Cliff City was prepared, they wouldn't be able to do anything. They had to catch the enemy off guard. Since it was just a chance encounter, there was nothing to worry about. Flying over one mountain after another. This was the strength of the vampires. They could cross the shortest distance at any time and attack the enemy with the fastest speed. Those lower races could only run on the road. Finally, they could vaguely see the outline of Isolated Cliff City. Tim screamed again, and his speed suddenly increased a notch. At this moment, the forest below suddenly trembled. Gargoyles flew out of the forest like a rainstorm. There were about 3,000 to 4,000 gargoyles. They were like a huge round mirror that covered the entire snowfield. If it were an ordinary person, they would definitely turn around and run away when they found that they had fallen into the enemy's ambush. But Tim was a noble vampire who was never afraid of any challenge. The moment the danger appeared, Tim had already forgotten his plan. There was only one thing left in his mind: fight. Without any hesitation, Tim flapped his wings and flew to the flank with his clansmen. The vampires were not good at aerial combat. After releasing the shape-shifting technique, they were at their weakest. As long as they could land on the ground, his clansmen would tear all these overconfident gargoyles into pieces. The formation of the gargoyles suddenly changed and formed a huge net. They were not in a hurry to join the battle, but just followed the vampires from below. Tim was stunned. If this continued, no matter which direction they flew in, his clansmen would be trapped in the huge net sooner or later. But he also found the weakness of the gargoyles. Their formation had become thinner. Tim immediately made a decision. He screamed and flew straight down to meet the gargoyles below. Nearly 1,000 vampires quickly formed a cone-shaped formation. With Tim as the spearhead, the vampires plunged downwards, attempting to forcefully break through the gargoyles' blockade. The gargoyles' formation also changed accordingly. Or rather, they were pulling in the net. The gargoyles in the center continued to gather, increasing the thickness of the formation. The gargoyles at the edge of the formation slanted upwards, attempting to outflank the vampire's rear wing. Boom! The vampires and the gargoyles finally collided. Although they were both aerial troops, there was a huge difference between the two. Gargoyles were just stone puppets. Whether they were flying in the sky or fighting on the ground, their combat strength would not change. On the other hand, the vampires could not display their strengths. But their level was far higher than the gargoyles, and with their tyrannical bodies, they could barely make up for some of the disadvantages. Gargoyles were constantly smashed into pieces, and vampires were constantly torn into pieces. The gargoyles did not know fear at all, and the vampires had forgotten what fear was. No one backed down, and the battle scene was very cruel. Tim did not want to be entangled with the gargoyles. The most powerful strength of the vampires was to absorb the blood of the enemy on the battlefield to restore their combat strength. But the gargoyles were just puppets, and their strength was useless. A burst of intense magic waves spread across the battlefield. Streams of cold air that could be seen with the naked eye suddenly appeared in the air. Not only was the formation of the gargoyles disrupted, but the vampires were also in a mess. Both sides had turned from an encirclement and breaking out of the encirclement into a chaotic battle where one side was in the middle of the other. Tim felt that his body was getting stiffer and stiffer. The cold current in the air had condensed into countless sharp ice shards. Every time he took a breath, he would feel a sharp pain in his throat. He didn't even dare to open his eyes. However, the gargoyles' movements were not affected by the cold current at all. The vampire's attack was immediately stopped. Tim understood the enemy's sinister intentions. He let out a scream that resounded throughout the battlefield. The vampires who were fighting for themselves quickly left the battle and gathered around Tim from all directions. Finally, Tim penetrated the entire battle formation and landed on the ground. The vampires followed behind him. Although some of their companions were surrounded by the gargoyles, they could not care less at this time. If they continued to fight in the air, they would be exhausted sooner or later. "It's too cold, isn't it?" Cain, who was standing on the top of the mountain, said softly. He then raised his magic staff. Tim had already found the enemy's position when he was in the air. After he returned to his original form, his first reaction was to rush to the top of the mountain. Of course, flying would be faster, but his subordinate's battle line was too long, and it was inevitable that they would be entangled by the gargoyles. Only by choosing the shortest distance to land on the ground could he ensure the safety of his people. A dazzling spark appeared on the snowfield, and then it exploded. Finally, it formed a bubble-like enchantment that slowly expanded in all directions. At the very beginning, the fiery bubble was only a few meters in radius. In a vast snowfield, it seemed very small, but soon, the bubble expanded to a radius of more than 10 meters. And the bigger the bubble, the faster it expanded. The group of gargoyles stopped chasing at the same time and spread their wings to escape into the sky. The bubble continued to expand 50 meters, 100 meters. Finally, it became a huge enchantment that covered an area of several hundred meters. Wherever the enchantment spread, the ice and snow melted. The grass, bushes, and ancient trees were all set ablaze. Many vampires were turned into flaming men, screaming, struggling, and running wildly. The bubble was still expanding, and the speed of expansion had far exceeded the speed of the vampires' sprinting speed. In the end, almost all of the vampires were enveloped in it. Then, with a deafening boom, the enchantment collapsed, and a suffocating heat wave swept in all directions. Radiation enchantment. It was a fire spell that covered a very large area, even exceeding the attack range of a small meteor shower. But its flaw was also very obvious. The power of this spell was constant. When a vampire was turned into a flaming man, or when an ancient tree was set ablaze, the power of the spell would be correspondingly weakened. The vampires that were enveloped by the enchantment at the beginning were almost all turned into charcoal, and the rest only suffered some burns. However, it was a rare achievement to kill dozens of vampires with one spell. "It's my turn," Yelena said softly, who knew that just as she stepped forward, Hanjin had already grabbed her arm. "What's wrong? Your 9 Thunder Descent will scare them away. It's too troublesome to chase them one by one." Hanjin smiled. Hogan and Kane had already made their moves, which had already put a lot of pressure on their opponents. The appearance of an 11th grade magus was too much of a test of their courage. "It's our turn, right?" Morrison's laughed. "Can you lend me your dragon spear?" Hanjin turned around and asked Guevara, "You know how to use a spear? But you don't have combat energy." Guevara was stunned, but he still passed the spear in his hand to Hanjin. The spear had just been completed yesterday. Yelena was, of course, the chief engineer. The dozen dwarves recruited from the alchemy laboratory were the assistant engineers. Guevara was the advisor, and Kane and Sasu were the assistants. With everyone's efforts, it took 6 days to complete. The entire body of the spear was made of dragon horns. Its shape was simple and square, and it did not have a blade. This was, of course, Guevara's idea. In the alchemy laboratory, Guevara had often belittled the elves' flashy art. He believed that weapons were used to kill people, and that external beauty could be completely ignored. Of course, the magic engraving was indispensable. On the pale green handle, there were flashes of lightning from time to time. Yelena was different from Sunir. She had no grudges with Guevara. On the contrary, when she learned about Guevara's past, she believed that Guevara was a tragic hero. He had spent a lot of energy making the spear, and she believed that this was the only way to match Guevara's status. In fact, it only took the dwarves 2 days to complete the body and blade of the spear. The rest of the time was spent waiting for Yelena's magic engraving. "It's too light." Hanjin looked around and tried to change his weapon. He liked the great sword in Morrison's hand, but if he did that, Morrison's would be very sad. Light? Do you think you're a barbarian? Forget it. I'll make do. Han Jin took a few steps forward and looked down. The vampires were already halfway up the mountain, and he could clearly see their fierce expressions. Chapter 229. Let's send the signal, Han Jin said slowly. Sunir pulled her longbow and pointed it at the sky. A whistling arrow whizzed into the sky and exploded, turning into a dazzling ball of fire. The gargoyle's interception had only reduced the number of vampires by 15%, and the magic released by Cain had only eliminated 10% of them. There were still about 700 to 800 vampires left. Even though the vampires were charging at them aggressively, no one was nervous, not only because of the presence of Guevara and Majordomo Gale, but also because of Yelena, who could release powerful magic at any time, and Han Jin. Winston and the others looked at Han Jin from time to time. In their usual chats, they had heard a lot about the giant magic circle set up by Han Jin from Morrison's. Although they came out in a hurry this time, and Han Jin did not have time to prepare, they believed in Han Jin's combat ability. As for the matter regarding Carolyn and Betty, Guevara had already given a reasonable explanation. Carolyn and Betty were originally 10th-stage powerhouses. Coupled with their terrifying innate talents, they could unleash the combat power of a 10th-stage powerhouse, or even a super-stage powerhouse. Follow me, Han Jin said softly, then jumped down the mountain. If it was in the past, Han Jin would release Earth Meld and suddenly appear in the midst of the vampires. However, from now on, he would not do anything that would waste his vital energy. Good steel should be used on the edge of the blade. Among all the spells, Spirit Possession was undoubtedly the most energy-conserving. Coupled with the charm of Spirit Refreshment, he could turn himself into a tireless fighting machine at any time. After a few leaps, Han Jin had already met Tim, who was rushing at the front. He was too lazy to talk, so he directly waved his war spear and smashed it down on Tim's head. Perhaps it was because his vital energy had been steadily increasing, but now that he was using Spirit Possession with all his might, he felt that it was a hindrance. This was because he had experienced resistance that he had never experienced before. For example, the resistance from the air made him feel a little uncomfortable. He could clearly see that the incomparably tough dragon spear had actually become bent, like an unformed bow. I could be faster. Why couldn't he speed up? This uncomfortable feeling annoyed Han Jin. Tim originally wanted to use his arm to block the opponent's attack and then engage in close combat, but he instinctively sensed danger. His body abruptly stopped, and he quickly retreated. The tip of the spear fell about half a foot in front of Tim. The biting cold and straight wind instantly split his messy hair into two halves. Only then did Tim hear the ear-piercing shriek. With a loud bang, the battle spear struck the snowy ground, and half of the spear had already sunk deep into the ground. Han Jin raised his hand and effortlessly pulled out the battle spear, sweeping it across Tim's neck. Tim lowered his body and jumped back. He was very surprised by the shot just now. He wanted to put some distance between them to clear his head. Tim retreated, but the two vampires who tried to participate in the battle were unlucky. The one who jumped up was directly split in half by Han Jin's spear. The one who bared his fangs and brandished his claws was even more miserable. Not only was his head separated from his body, but his arms were also chopped off by Han Jin. On the other side, Winston and the others also joined the battle. Winston was usually very amiable and had a very good temper, but his fighting style was completely different from the impression he gave people. His swordsmanship was tricky and fierce, and formed a sharp contrast with Saxon, who was on his left. Although both of them used dragon flame fighting techniques, Saxon's swordsmanship mainly focused on slashing, while Winston's swordsmanship only focused on stabbing. His sword was fast, and his sword was even faster. He was like a ruthless scorpion. Gibran, Leger, and Reaper Paul, these three thieves, had similar fighting styles. They all used their speed to weave in and out of the enemy's group. Once they were surrounded, they would immediately release their invisibility and escape from the battle, then reappear in another location. Julia and Sunir stood on top of the mountain, respectively sniping the approaching vampires. Sunir was holding Edwina's relic, the longbow made of dragon tendons. She hadn't been learning the ripping wind arrow for long, so she was still far from fully mastering it. However, the magical weapon made by Yelena had a powerful amplification effect. In terms of sniping results, she had already surpassed Julia. Julia was good at treant arrows, and using them to kill ordinary vampires was like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. At least, Julia felt that it was too wasteful, so she switched to ordinary magical arrows. However, the bravest person on the battlefield was Morrison's. His sprinting speed was also extremely fast, and he followed closely behind Hanjin. His greatsword danced like a windmill, and he only advanced and never retreated. Morrison's was now extremely rampant and unrestrained. He was wearing dragon-scale leather armor, which Hanjin had granted him a second life. In times of danger, he could even use the Earthmeld magic scroll to escape. Of course, the so-called magic scroll was only what Morrison's and the others called it. With these, if he didn't become more rampant and unrestrained, he would be letting himself down. However, Morrison's also knew his limits. No matter what kind of opponent he was facing, he would only attack once. If he could kill them, he would kill them. If he couldn't kill them, he would just rush over and leave them for the people behind him to deal with. After all, he was surrounded by enemies, so he didn't have to worry about not being able to find someone to kill. The most low-key person was none other than Alexander. Logically speaking, since it was his first time participating in a battle with Hanjin, as a newcomer, he should try his best to show off his combat strength and win the attention of his boss. However, this person didn't seem to like being in the limelight. From the beginning of the battle until now, his eyes had never left Hanjin, and he didn't take the initiative to attack anyone. Only when a reckless vampire jumped at him did he raise his spear and send the vampire flying. He didn't even release his combat power. In comparison, Hanjin was much more persistent than Morrison's. After Tim escaped from his hands, he chased after Tim relentlessly. The blade of the dragon's spear constantly moved in front of Tim, and the vampires who tried to help him were either sent flying far away or turned into a pile of broken limbs. Hanjin relied on the art of spirit possession to greatly increase his strength, speed, and reflexes. As the saying goes, a strong man could defeat 10 skilled men. If he couldn't compete with Hanjin in terms of strength and speed, then he wouldn't be able to use his skills. In fact, if they were to fight hand-to-hand under the same conditions, Hanjin would be far inferior to Tim. Of course, what Hanjin really relied on was not the art of spirit possession, but the various Tao techniques that shone like the stars in the sky. On the mountaintop, Guevara's expression kept changing. He wasn't surprised by Hanjin, but rather, he felt sorry for his dragon spear. The profound meaning of the spear was, of course, mainly for stabbing. If it was just a swing and slash, then it would be better to use a big hammer. Nonsense. This was simply nonsense. The more Tim retreated, the more panicked he became. He never thought that a human speed could be so close to the limit. Only when the tip of his opponent's spear was close to his body did he hear the sound of the wind breaking through the air. If it weren't for the fact that his opponent's movement was so obvious, allowing him to determine the attack's range and angle before the attack was released, he would have been killed on the spot. "Why are you following me?" Hanjin suddenly stopped, turned around, and shouted to Alexander, "Catch!" After that, he threw the dragon spear in his hand. An opportunity. Tim was ecstatic, but the pressure he felt before was too great. Tim hesitated for a moment and didn't take advantage of the situation to counterattack. Tim didn't move, but the other vampire roared and pounced on Hanjin. Hanjin opened his mouth, and a green light shot out. It instantly pierced through the vampire's face, leaving a bloody hole as wide as a big bowl. To be precise, the vampire's facial features had all disappeared, including his 2 rows of teeth. His originally handsome head had become a hollow, bloody ring, and some paste fell from the top of the ring. The scene was disgusting and terrifying. Seeing this, Tim couldn't help but let out a slightly trembling scream. He never expected that his opponent had been hiding his strength all this time, and only used his real killing move now. He was already at an absolute disadvantage just now, and now it was even more impossible for him to defend himself. Under the guidance of Hanjin's spirit, the green light shot straight at Tim. Tim hurriedly dodged to the side, but the green light suddenly drew an arc and chased after him again. Tim tried his best to dodge, but the green light also swayed a few times. The faster he dodged, the faster the green light chased after him. Seeing that the green light was less than 2 meters away from him, Tim hurriedly grabbed a clansman and used him as a shield. The moment he felt the green light enter his body, he threw his clansman into the air, but the next moment, the green light passed through his body and shot towards him again. "Kill him!" Tim screamed. At this moment, he couldn't use words to describe the fear in his heart. For vampires, no matter what the situation was, Tim's words were orders that had to be carried out. As soon as he finished speaking, the nearby vampires all rushed towards Hanjin. Hanjin waved his hand, and 4 small swords emitting red light appeared in his hand. With a light wave of his finger, the small swords shot out at the same time, and the 4 vampires closest to him were instantly pierced through. Then, Hanjin's right hand continuously slapped the air, and one white light after another rushed into the air, exploding into a dazzling rain of light. After receiving Guevara's warning, Hanjin had already made a large number of pure light talismans. Now that he had a clear understanding of the enemy's strength, he no longer had any scruples. Under the rain of light, most of the vampires couldn't help but cover their eyes, and then let out a series of miserable screams. They were already at a disadvantage, and without the support of a high-grade powerhouse, it was very difficult for them to stop the one-sided slaughter. Now that they were blind, the situation was even more critical. Battle cries came from the horizon. Dwight Steele led the Dragon Singer mercenary group to surround them from the left flank, while Juventus led the mercenaries from the Mercenary Association and some temporarily recruited mercenary teams and mercenary groups to surround them from the right flank. Tim quickly retreated as he scanned the battlefield, and he suddenly realized how stupid he had been. The enemy had several powerful high-grade professionals, and they were killing his clansmen as if there was no resistance. In addition, there were the 2 great magicians who hadn't shown up yet, and the reinforcements that had surrounded them. With so many powerful professionals gathered together, let alone Tim, even Lord Zagund wouldn't be able to escape alive. Moreover, the thousands of gargoyles had absolute air superiority. Tim was really desperate. Chapter 230. Almost 1,000 vampires were quickly annihilated. To be precise, this was the first time that isolated Cliff City had fought against an invading force, and the first time that they were united. The Mercenary Association, the Dragon Singer mercenary group, the Red Vanguards, the Reapers, and Hanjin might not represent all the mercenaries, but they were not far off. The final result was gratifying. Not only were they annihilated, but they also won. The one who contributed the most was, of course, Hanjin. Hogan was one of his men, and the thousands of gargoyles who had absolute control of the air helped a lot. The pure light spell that Hanjin released himself had also greatly reduced the vampire's combat power. In total, the Dragon Singer mercenary group and the Mercenary Association only had 20 or so casualties, while the Reapers had 0 casualties. Of course, the Reapers were an elite mercenary group, so it was not appropriate to compare them to the Dragon Singer mercenary group and the Mercenary Association. All the mercenaries who had participated in the battle knew that without Hanjin, they would not have been able to achieve such a result. When the news spread back to isolated Cliff City, the morale of the mercenaries was greatly boosted. The infamous Vampire Guard was just so. In the past, the mercenaries did not talk much about war because it was a completely different life. Isolated Cliff City had never participated in any kind of war, but after this great victory, there were suddenly more discussions about war. Many mercenaries thought that isolated Cliff City could speak up and should speak up. However, the lives of Hanjin and the others were peaceful again. They did nothing but cultivate. Isolated Cliff City was also very peaceful. Zagun still focused on his underground city, and Dismark was too far away to help. Even if he wanted to, he could not do anything. However, there was a problem on Lang Ning's side. During a routine inspection, Lang Ning personally led his generals to survey the terrain, but they were suddenly attacked by Woodrow and his students. In the end, Lang Ning only managed to escape with a few generals, while the rest of the generals were all killed in a sea of fire. If others saw this battle report, they would only think that Lang Ning was too unlucky or too careless. However, Han Jin gasped. A great change of blood. This was Han Jin's first judgment. Leger's father had a significant influence in Riptide. When Leger's opinion was different from Lang Ning's, the generals in the army would always be divided into two factions and argue with each other endlessly. Although Leger did not want to interfere in military affairs, and even gave power to Lang Ning, he cherished his father's reputation and the reputation of Riptide. When he encountered something that he thought was wrong, he had to speak out and oppose it. As a result, Lang Ning had to spend a lot of energy to ensure the cooperation of the army. This was a vicious plan to kill several birds with one stone. Riptide's high-level command system was damaged, so its combat power would definitely be sharply reduced. At least, that was how the enemy saw it. Not only did it numb Woodrow's remaining army, but it also numbed the joint army of the 4 Bite-Man Castellans. At the same time, it also eliminated the opposition forces in the army. Han Jin had a feeling that those who died should be the generals who were loyal to Leger. Of course, this was all just Han Jin's judgment. However, he had evidence. In the past, whenever Riptide sent someone to contact them, they would first find Leger or Guevara. Then, Leger would pass the letter to him. If Leger felt that there was no need to trouble Han Jin, he would naturally not see it. Now that Lang Ning sent someone to pass the letter directly to him, this was a signal that Lang Ning could completely control the army. In fact, when he first met Lang Ning's outlook on life was not complete. The reason why he did what he did was because of Guevara's indoctrination and subtle influence. Ideals were sometimes an angel, but sometimes they could turn into a devil. Lang Ning believed that Leger's way of thinking would not work in troubled times. He had tried to persuade him, argued with him, and opposed him. Now, he simply raised the sword in his hand and tried to completely drive out the influence of the previous generation of leaders. Thinking back, Leger and Lang Ning had a good relationship. When they attacked Black Raven City, the two of them quarreled from time to time. After rescuing Guevara, their relationship deteriorated to the point of avoiding each other. As the saying goes, people who walk different paths cannot make plans together. Han Jin did not understand the meaning of this saying before, but now he understood the cruelty behind it. Even friends who grew up together could become strangers. Human nature. However, Han Jin did not dislike Lang Ning's decision. It would only benefit him if Lang Ning could completely control the army. Moreover, he had the same opinion as Lang Ning. If he continued to act like a Knight of Conrad, the Riptide army would not be able to achieve anything. In troubled times, one had to be ruthless. Lang Ning was a man who planned before acting. Since he had done it, he must have made sufficient preparations and would not affect the upcoming war. The only thing that made Han Jin uneasy was that he did not know whether Leger could see the strangeness in it. Although he did not agree with Leger's insistence, a friend was a friend after all. In the blink of an eye, winter passed and spring came. The white snowfield gradually melted and turned into a world full of vitality. The magic transmission circles that had been closed for a long time were opened one after another. The mercenaries were busy again. In the center of the construction site, Hogan leaned on a recliner and lazily enjoyed the warmth of spring. Two maids took turns massaging his shoulders behind the recliner. Although the weather was still cold, it was warm enough for an ice archmage who lived in the ice field. Suddenly, Hogan felt a shake as if someone had deliberately kicked his chair. He could not help but frown and turn around. At first glance, he saw Han Jin. Hogan jumped up in an action that did not match an old man's. He smiled and said, "Master, you're here." "Yes." Han Jin glanced at the strong men around him. How long will it take to finish? It'll take a few more months. Han Jin's eyes fell on the two maids. How does he treat you? The two maids looked at each other. They knew who Han Jin was referring to. He's very good. Master, please sit, please sit. Hogan smiled and moved aside. Han Jin didn't need to be courteous to his slaves and sat down on the reclining chair. Hogan and Alexander often quarreled because of sleeping with each other. In the end, it was Han Jin who made the decision and allowed Hogan to choose two female slaves as his maids. From the perspective of modern people, this was cruel and unfair. However, there was no fairness in this world. Moreover, the day they became slaves, they should have been mentally prepared for their future. Hogan was very tired. He had to teach Cold Shadow City alchemy to Yelena, Sassu, and Kane. At the same time, he had to constantly make gargoyles. He was also in charge of the construction. He was responsible for investigating the movements around isolated Cliff City, removing the restraining rings on the slaves' heads, self-cultivation, and so on. Since Hogan was working so hard, Han Jin could not be too harsh. It was impossible to want the horse to run and not eat grass. At most, he told Hogan to treat his maids better and not be like before. Han Jin pondered for a moment and said, Hogan, our people have returned from Cold Shadow City. They've heard some news. You can probably guess it. What news? Hogan paused. Master, please tell me. Your wife, your two sons, and your servants were all killed by Che-Sam. Hogan turned into a statue. His eyes stared straight at the ground. After a while, he let out a long sigh. You don't seem to be very sad. Han Jin was a little surprised. When he came here, he had already thought of several ways to comfort Hogan. Now that he saw Hogan's reaction, it might not be necessary. Master, I used to be a fallen noble. You can't possibly know my difficulties. I'm also a fallen noble, Han Jin said lightly. I've heard about you, but I'm not like you. Hogan smiled bitterly. I became a pauper overnight. It doesn't feel good to be a pauper. Han Jin laughed. A fallen noble couldn't even compare to a normal farmer. A farmer at least had the means to make a living, but a fallen noble, in order to maintain their last shred of dignity, would often refuse to do lowly work. In the past, Raphael was so poor that he would rather hide in a corner and wait for death than work. He was the epitome of a parasite. Yes, Hogan was stunned for a moment. Master, did Che-Sam only kill my family? Did he punish Dempus' family? I'm not sure about that. What kind of person is Dempus? A person who deserves to die. Seeing that Hogan was unwilling to speak, Han Jin didn't pursue the matter. He was concerned about another matter. No matter what kind of person Hogan was, he should at least have feelings for his family. Hogan's current attitude made him feel very uneasy. There were a lot of things that he needed Hogan to do or assist. He didn't want to see any loopholes. You're really not sad for your family? I'm sad. Hogan's smile appeared very strange. However, Dempus will be sadder than me. Dempus again. Han Jin couldn't help but furrow his brows. Hogan waved his hand, and the two maids quietly retreated far away. He then paused for a moment and said with a helpless tone, Master, speaking of which, that was my greatest shame. I was very, very poor before. Although the teachers at the Magic Academy thought that I had outstanding talent in magic, I had to drop out. Later on, someone found me and asked me to marry his daughter. Haha, that woman was already pregnant for a few months. He didn't want to lose face and didn't dare to settle the score with Dempus, so he could only wrong a poor man like me. Of course, I also got what I wanted, which was to continue studying in the Magic Academy. You have two sons? Yes. These two sentences sounded like nonsense, but Hogan had already admitted to some things. Han Jin also understood some things. It was Dempus' freedom to do as he pleased with an unmarried woman. However, Hogan was already married to that woman. If he continued to pester her, it would be too much of a bully. No wonder Hogan's smile was so strange. Don't think about the past anymore, Han Jin said softly. Dempus, is it? One day, I'll make him crawl at your feet. Chapter 231. The door opened, and Sunir walked in quietly. She then closed the door and tiptoed to peek through the crack. Han Jin was stunned. Why was Sunir acting like a thief today? Sunir turned around and shushed Han Jin. She then waved at Han Jin, gesturing for him to hurry over. Han Jin's curiosity was piqued. He walked to the door and peeked through the crack that Sunir had made for him. He saw Miriam sitting on a stump in the courtyard. There was a wooden basin in front of her, which contained the clothes that Han Jin had changed out of. Stillberg was squatting beside Miriam, saying something to her. However, Miriam's attitude was rather cold. She didn't raise her head, nor did she respond to Stillberg's enthusiasm. "This is—" Han Jin smiled and whispered, "But he's not that young anymore. Don't you think that they're very compatible?" Sunir smiled. In reality, Stillberg was basically trash. Although he had learned Han Jin's magic, the effects were not obvious. If it were anyone else, Sunir wouldn't have cared, but Stillberg was different. When Han Jin was at his poorest, Stillberg had always been by his side. He was even more loyal to Han Jin. As the saying goes, love the house, love the crow that belongs to the house. Sunir had already treated Stillberg as a companion. Now that she saw that Stillberg was showing some signs of interest, she really wanted to matchmake them. Han Jin muttered to himself. He was a little dissatisfied with Miriam. A girl should be more cheerful and lively. But then again, after going through all those tragedies, Miriam's change was understandable. The most important thing was Stillberg's attitude. If Stillberg really liked Miriam, then Han Jin had the responsibility to help him. Sunir leaned against the crack in the door again. Stillberg spoke for a long time, but Miriam didn't respond. He smiled and reached out as if to grab the clothes in the basin. However, Miriam reacted quickly and slapped Stillberg's hand to the side. "This idiot," Sunir said in disappointment. She felt that Stillberg was being a little too impatient. "I'm not that young anymore," Han Jin said softly. Yes. Sunir's attention was focused on the outside, so she didn't understand what Han Jin meant. Han Jin shook his head and hugged Sunir from behind. Sunir's body stiffened, and she hurriedly tried to pry Han Jin's arm away. "Stop fooling around," she whispered. "There are people outside. Are you fooling around?" Han Jin said. "I'm not that young anymore. Stillberg is only a few months older than me. Sunir, shouldn't we consider our relationship? Spring is here. What is this?" Sunir bit her lip. "A proposal? You can say that. Can you be a little more formal?" Sunir rolled her eyes at Han Jin. "How formal? Like a knight meeting a queen?" Han Jin laughed. It had been a few months since that battle. As the saying goes, it's easier to change mountains and rivers than to change one's nature. Han Jin had always been a very optimistic person, and his mood was no longer as gloomy. Sunir rolled her eyes, and just as she was about to say something, Han Jin's face was already close to hers, and in the next moment, he kissed her on the lips. Sunir was no longer the same as before, and after a little resistance, she gently opened her mouth and allowed Han Jin to bully her. At this moment, Yelena appeared in the courtyard. She looked very excited, and she ignored Stillberg and Miriam in the courtyard. She hurried to the door and pushed it open. Han Jin and Sunir were kissing passionately, and Han Jin's hand was still moving around a certain part of her body. Seeing this, Yelena's face suddenly turned red, and she stood there dumbfounded, unable to move forward or back away. Sunir screamed and pushed Han Jin away with all her might. She wanted to rush out, but Yelena blocked her way. Sunir had no choice but to rush into the room. Without taking off her shoes, she jumped onto the bed and covered herself tightly with the blanket. "Miss Yelena, manners, manners," Han Jin said helplessly. In fact, he had already heard the sound of footsteps, but he didn't expect her to not knock on the door. I'm sorry." Yelena laughed dryly. "Do you need something from me?" "It's okay." Yelena subconsciously wanted to leave, but then she remembered something. "No, Raphael, when are we going back to the Magic Beast Forest? What are we going to do in the forest?" That dragon bone." Yelena took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. "Do you know about the frost dragon in Cold Shadow City? With those dragon bones, I can make a dragon puppet. Although it can only last for a short time, it's still a real frost dragon. Frost Dragon. Forget it. I'll come find you at night. Yelena had a lot to say on the way here, but she really didn't have the courage to continue. She threw out a sentence that didn't make any sense, turned around, and ran away in a panic. Hanjin pondered as he closed the door. In fact, he also had a lot to ask, but now wasn't the time. Walking to the bed, Hanjin reached out and patted the blanket. She's gone. Sunir didn't react at all, as if she didn't hear Hanjin. Hanjin had no choice but to shout, "Come out, Yelena's gone." Sunir lifted the blanket bit by bit until only half of her head was exposed. She carefully looked out. Whether she was an elven archer who had been through a lot or a high and mighty inheritor of God's mark, at this moment, she had turned into a frightened little rabbit. Her shy expression was exceptionally lovable. "She's really gone." Hanjin helplessly repeated the nonsense. Sunir lifted the blanket and covered herself again. She said in a muffled voice under the blanket, "It's all your fault. How am I going to face them in the future? Why can't you see them? According to what you said, what should those married women do?" Hanjin didn't know whether to laugh or cry. His gaze fell on the foot of the bed. "Sunir, Miriam is very pitiful. Let's not give her any trouble, okay?" "Huh?" Sunir didn't understand what Hanjin meant. Hanjin moved to the foot of the bed, lifted the blanket, and grabbed Sunir's calf. He took off her little combat boots and then grabbed her other foot. Sunir's reaction was a few beats slower. By the time she realized that something was wrong and hurriedly kicked her feet, her boots had already been taken off. She could only shrink her feet under the blanket. Hanjin remembered seeing a different psychological test in the past. Most men liked women, but their favorite parts were different. Some liked breasts, some liked hair, some liked faces, some liked legs, and some liked buttocks. It was said that men who liked legs and feet were the type who were passionate on the inside. Of course, this was just a test to make people laugh. Hanjin liked legs and feet, but he would never admit that he was passionate on the inside. Hanjin reached his hand under the blanket to touch Sunir's feet. The moment the two touched, Sunir hurriedly shrank back. Hanjin touched her again, and Sunir retreated again. However, the bed was only so big. Sunir finally reached the point where she could retreat. She lifted a small corner of the blanket and whispered, "What are you doing?" Hanjin smiled and took the opportunity to grab Sunir's little feet. He gently played with them. He liked the delicate and smooth feeling. He had known Sunir for almost 2 years, but he had never challenged Sunir's limits. It wasn't that he had a strong will, but that he had a lofty goal. A person's energy was limited. If he spent all his energy on that goal, he would naturally have less energy in other areas. Sunir struggled at first, but Hanjin held her tightly. She gave up, struggling, and quietly observed Hanjin under the blanket. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Chipango's voice came from outside. "Sir." Hanjin stiffened for a moment. He helplessly put down Sunir's little feet and angrily covered himself with the blanket. He turned around and walked to the door. Chipango wanted to continue knocking, but the door was forcefully pulled open. Hanjin stood at the door and asked angrily, "What is it?" Chipango saw that Hanjin's mood was a bit off and didn't know what to say. Hallister continued, "Sir, did Winston and the others leave?" "Yes." Hanjin nodded. "They accepted a mission." "Sir, something's not right." "What's wrong?" "I know what kind of mission they accepted. 200 wind spirit herbs, 3 grade 9 lightning magic crystals, and 10 thunderbird eggs. That's a total of 210,000 gold coins. Don't you think the reward is too high?" "It shouldn't be." Hanjin frowned. "Winston and I were talking last night. The caravan that issued the mission had already left a deposit of 20,000 gold coins at the Mercenary Association. No one would joke around with 20,000 gold coins. The problem is they really did use 20,000 gold coins to joke around," Hallister said. Hallister said, "Yesterday, I secretly investigated the caravan. Although I didn't find anything, they left isolated Cliff City this morning. All of them left, not a single person was left behind. Maybe they'll come back after a while." Winston said that this mission would take at least 2 months. After 1 month, the Thunderbirds will lay their eggs. That caravan should know that. Sir, there's only one place that has wind bell herbs and grade 9 lightning magic crystals. It's obvious that they want Winston and the others to hunt thunderbirds and thunderbird eggs. Hallister said slowly. Sir, the mission items all point to the same place, Thunder Valley. Well, Han Jean hesitated. Sir, when I learned that the caravan had left isolated Cliff City, I immediately sent people to the Dawn Mercenary Team's base. The main force of the Dawn Mercenary Team left 3 days ago, Hallister said. Hallister continued. After that, I contacted the Mercenary Association and found out that the Dawn Mercenary Band used the third portal in the southwest region. That portal was closest to Thunder Valley. Sir, there are too many coincidences. Go find Gibran and Leger. Also, don't forget Yelena. Han Jean made a decision. Chapter 232. Time was running out. Winston and the others had already walked for half a day. If they could speed up, they should be able to catch up before they entered Thunder Valley. Guevara went to the Chamber of Commerce, and Han Jean didn't have time to greet him. Guevara had to go back to help Lang Ning in the battle in a few days, so he couldn't accompany them to the Terashan Mountains. Because of the possibility of a battle, Han Jean asked Sunir, Morrisons, and Sassu to stay in the city. Sunir was a little unhappy, but Han Jean had his own concerns. Sunir and Alexander were like fire and water, and Morrisons and Sassu might not be able to suppress them. They didn't dare to disobey Sunir's words. After giving some simple instructions, Han Jean and the others walked into the teleportation array. There were Yelena, Gibran, Julia, Kane, and Leger. Major Domo Gale couldn't leave because he had to protect Yelena's second brother, Edison. However, although Han Jin's group was small in number, it was enough to look down on all the mercenary groups in isolated Cliff City. The Red Vanguards were a first-class mercenary group, and Yelena's role was far more important than the Dead Hayden and Charles. With Han Jin's help, even if there was an accident, they could handle it. After a dazzling white light flashed, isolated Cliff City disappeared in front of them and was replaced by an endless expanse of green. Yelena habitually released dozens of detection magic, and the flashing magic halo covered the surrounding hundreds of meters. Gibran quickly looked around and didn't find anything unusual. Winston doesn't look like a careless person, but he was too careless this time, Leger suddenly said. You can't blame him, Gibran said. There are often missions in the Mercenary Association that don't require too much effort but have a high reward. Sometimes it's because the person who issued the mission doesn't know the market, and sometimes it's because it's too urgent. That's a huge mission with more than 200,000 gold coins. How could they not know the market? Besides, they should know that it's not the breeding season for the Thunderbirds. How could the person who issued the mission not know? What's the hurry? Now that I think about it, there's indeed something wrong. But who would have thought so much at that time? Gibran said, if it were me, I wouldn't doubt it either. I would only think that I had picked up a huge bargain. Gibran is right. People are always careless. If everyone didn't make mistakes, the right path would have long been filled with people, Han Jean said. Raphael, that Hallister is a talent, Gibran said. Han Jean laughed. It's nothing strange that he found something wrong. What's rare is that he immediately went to investigate. At least, he's a very diligent person. Gibran identified the direction as he spoke. This way, I've been to Thunder Valley a few times and have a deep impression of it. What are you doing there? Is it also a quest? Leja asked. The first time, I accidentally barged in. After that, I was on a mission. Gibran paused. Everyone be careful. It's very dangerous there. Danger? The last time I was there was 2 years ago. Gibran recalled as he led the way. At that time, there were about 70 Thunderbirds in Thunder Valley. I don't know how many there are now. Maybe there are more. Maybe there are fewer. Yelena gasped. Last autumn, she and Han Jean had worked together to kill a Thunderbird in the forest. It was a 9th-grade holy animal after all, and it had taken her quite a bit of effort. If more than 70 Thunderbirds had attacked together, even her father, the Grand Duke Solomon, would have had no choice but to run away, let alone her. Thunder Valley is a forbidden area in the Terashan Mountains, Julia added, the high-level and top-level magical beasts in the forest don't dare to rashly clash with large groups of thunderbirds. Many years ago, I saw with my own eyes more than 40 thunderbirds besieging a fire phoenix. The fire phoenix didn't even have the chance to escape. Those thunderbirds released lightning together and instantly turned the fire phoenix into ashes. Does Winston know that there are more than 70 thunderbirds there? Yelena asked. He's been there before, so he should know. Then why do they still dare to go? Leger asked. According to what you said, no one can go, Gibran laughed. Then he pointed to his head with his finger. To deal with a large group of thunderbirds, we rely on experience and wisdom. Since there is nothing that can threaten the thunderbirds, then, after 2 years, the number of thunderbirds should be more than 100, right? Han Jin asked. Not necessarily. Gibran shook his head. Thunderbirds are holy beasts that live in groups and are very united, but there are also times when they kill each other. For example, when the original Thunderbird King is old, the young Thunderbirds will challenge him. Usually, the old Thunderbird King will be the loser and leave with the Thunderbirds that are willing to follow him, leaving Thunder Valley to the new king. I heard from some old mercenaries that the number of Thunderbirds in Thunder Valley is at most 100. Only 100? Leger smiled bitterly. Even if there are only 10 Thunderbirds, it's enough to pose a threat to us. 100 Thunderbirds is indeed not a lot, Julia said softly. If you're in Paradise Lost, don't be surprised to see hundreds of Thunderbirds flying together. Maybe you'll soon see thousands of Thunderbirds together. Paradise Lost? You went to Paradise Lost? Leger was shocked. Paradise Lost? What is that place? Han Jin asked curiously. You don't know? Julia was more curious than Han Jin. I don't know. Han Jin shook his head honestly. Paradise Lost is in the center of the Terrashaw Mountains. It covers a very large area, about a third of the Terrashaw Mountains, Gibran said slowly. The reason why it's called Paradise Lost is because it's filled with fear. Even an ultra-class master can't laugh. Raphael, think about it. If you see a Hydra charging at you, maybe you will choose to fight. But if you see a dozen Hydras charging at you together, what will you do? Julia smiled. In Paradise Lost, a magical beast can't survive alone. Even the arrogant unicorns can only choose to move in groups. That's scary? Then I really want to see it. Raphael, are you kidding? Leger was shocked. I just want to run in there and laugh a few times, then run out. Han Jin shrugged. With the protection of Earthmeld, he could go anywhere he wanted. He had this confidence. Even if his opponent was extremely powerful, he could still escape. Nonsense. Yelena rolled her eyes at Han Jin. We are now in the southwest area, which is actually the southwest of Paradise Lost. If you want to go, I will take you there after we find Winston. Gibran, are you crazy? Julia yelled. Don't be ridiculous. You said that Paradise Lost is in the middle of the Terrashaw Mountains? We are in the southwest area. So are we on the other side of the continent? Han Jin asked hurriedly. Yes. What is the nearest city called? Gibran thought for a moment. It is Magiana City, but I heard that Magiana City has been reduced to ruins and now belongs to Iron Fist City. Then why don't we see mercenaries from other places? You have only been to the southwest area, right? If you go to other places, you should have a chance to meet mercenaries from other places. What kind of place is Iron Fist City? Have you been there before? I don't know. It would take 5 to 6 months to walk out of the forest. I don't have the time or energy. Besides, what are we going to do? It's not like we can't survive in isolated Cliff City. We should make use of the time to earn more money, retire, and enjoy life. If you really want to know more about Iron Fist City, I will ask around for you when we go back. There should be people from Iron Fist City. Raphael, if you meet mercenaries from other places, you must be alert. We can be friendly, but others may not, Julia said. Yes, Julia is right, Leger said. Han Jin pondered. Although he had been to the southwest area before, he didn't expect it to be on the other side of the continent. The magic teleportation circle was indeed magical. Perhaps it was because of Guevara's repeated hints. Han Jin subconsciously thought of himself as the future lord and gradually adapted to consider problems from many aspects. Gibran, those caravans always travel long distances to isolated Cliff City to buy goods and then transport them back. Why don't they build a magic teleportation circle in isolated Cliff City? Wouldn't it be more convenient? That is absolutely not allowed. Yelena looked at Han Jin as if she was looking at a monster. Do you think anyone can control the original data of the magic recording? Even if it's only a one-way teleportation circle, they can use the original data to build another one at the teleportation point and change it from one-way to two-way. Then wouldn't isolated Cliff City become an undefended city? They can build it near isolated Cliff City. That still won't work. If isolated Cliff City was mine, I would immediately attack anyone who built a teleportation circle within 100 miles of isolated Cliff City. And building a teleportation circle is not that simple, Gibran said. Gibran said, first of all, we need a magician with deep attainments in spatial magic. We also need a large amount of magic crystals and magic materials. After it's completed, we also need to send people to guard it all year round. Otherwise, a mouse can destroy the teleportation array. The people guarding it must be very strong. Every teleportation array is a small treasure trove. It's inevitable that people will covet it. Do you think any merchant guild has this kind of power? So troublesome? Every time the teleportation circle is activated, magic crystals will be consumed. For example, how much did we spend to come to the southwest region this time? Leger laughed. How much did it cost to transport the goods back with the carriage? Of course, it's under the condition that safety is guaranteed. Safety is not an issue. Dismark and Zagund fought so fiercely, but neither of them robbed the other's caravan. This is a double-edged sword. If you rob me, I'll definitely find a way to rob you. In the end, the Chamber of Commerce can only refuse to cooperate with them, which is not beneficial to them at all, Gibran said. Moreover, the caravan always goes by the bite man, so they have no chance to rob it even if they want to. Chapter 233. No, it doesn't count. Harley yelled, his 2 rows of teeth grinding rapidly. Below him, there was a very strange 6-pointed star with a similar number of small branches and stones placed on it. However, there was no one in the direction he was facing, and no one knew who he was talking to. The next moment, Harley's body turned into a wisp of smoke and then appeared on the opposite side, shouting, "Stop! Playing chess is the same as fighting a war. Can you start over if you lose?" Then, as another wisp of smoke, Harley ran back to his original position. "Don't be so serious, brother. Who doesn't make mistakes? Give me a chance. Give me a chance." Then, Harley ran back to the opposite side. "Brother, it's not that I don't want to give you a chance. If you regret your move, and I regret my move, we won't be able to finish this game in 100 years. Harley ran back to his original position and sighed. "You're too serious." Before he could finish a sentence, a stone shot through the chessboard and messed up the chess pieces. Harley was furious. He turned his head and saw Han Jin's expressionless face. He hurriedly smiled and said, "Master, you're awake? You're very noisy, you know that?" Han Jin said in an unhappy tone. Harley laughed dryly. Han Jin slowly stood up, stretched his body a few times, and looked up at the sky. "It's almost dawn." Yes. You didn't notice anything the whole night." "No, it's been very quiet here." "You didn't slack off, did you?" "Master, how could I?" Harley was a little anxious. "Besides, I'm getting stronger and stronger. Even if I don't do anything, I can feel the breath of any life approaching." Han Jin turned around and glanced at the cave, where Yelena and the others were temporarily staying. He didn't ask any more questions, then took out a fire magic crystal from a space ring and put it in his mouth. His strength had been growing rapidly and steadily. At the beginning of winter, he could absorb the energy of 3 fifth-order magic crystals a day. Now he could absorb the energy of 4 fifth-order magic crystals. In another month, he would be able to absorb the energy of 5 magic crystals at once. He was very satisfied with his progress. In the other world, he was worried because he couldn't find any treasures, but here, he was complaining that time was passing too slowly. It was as if Harley had seen a new continent. He quickly floated in front of Han Jin and shook his skull. He observed Han Jin's mouth from every angle, trying to see what was happening inside. "Get out of my way," Han Jin said angrily. "Oh my God." Although Harley moved to the side, his mouth was not idle. "Master, what are you doing? Devouring magic crystals?" "Don't ask what you shouldn't ask," Han Jin said indifferently. Then, he walked behind an old tree and sat down. "But, don't you feel uncomfortable?" Harley followed Han Jin closely, unwilling to give up. "It seems that you want to go back." "Don't. Master, it's too boring to stay with that guy." "Then you better behave." Han Jin took out another magic crystal and put it in his mouth. Harley didn't dare to speak, but the two red lights in his eyes were fixed on Han Jin's mouth. Obviously, this guy was someone who liked to explore mysteries when he was alive. "Harley." "Yes, Master." "Do you know Paradise Lost?" "Of course I do." "If you run into Paradise Lost, can you guarantee your own safety?" Harley hesitated. He wanted to brag about his strength, but he was afraid that Han Jin would really let him go to Paradise Lost. He had to tell the truth. "Most magic beasts can release magic." "Master, the higher the grade of the magic beast, the stronger the magic." "In Paradise Lost, I understand." Han Jin interrupted Harley. Although he had enough energy for now, it was hard to say what would happen in the future, especially after he stepped into the realm of Tai. The energy he could absorb would be hundreds or thousands of times more than now. All the magic crystals that Sunir bought might not even be enough for him in a day. Therefore, he needed to prepare for the future. "Master, are you going to Paradise Lost?" Harley asked nervously. "No, it's all right. It gave me a fright." Han Jin ignored Harley. He took out another 2 magic crystals and threw them into his mouth. Then, he closed his eyes and adjusted his breath. Seeing that Han Jin had started to cultivate, Harley guarded him with a sense of responsibility. He was much more serious than last night. After a long time, Han Jin slowly opened his eyes and opened his mouth. A green light slowly floated out of his mouth and fell into his palm. There were many ways to refine weapons, and his master had once commented on the pros and cons of each of them. What he liked the most was a refining method that used his own body as a cauldron, without the help of any external forces. It was true that if he had an immortal magic weapon like the Shinnon Cauldron, the magic weapon he refined would be extremely powerful. However, the method he chose also had its own advantages, which was the ability to grow. He could keep adding talismans on a magic weapon. Just like the immortal binding rope, he had not succeeded in refining it yet. However, he could refine it in stages. If he used external help, he must succeed in one try. Otherwise, the materials would be wasted. However, he did not dare to try refining it internally. He could only choose external refining. Harley was very familiar with the green light. After all, he had been hiding in it for a long time. When he saw his old friend, the red light in his eyes suddenly lit up. He carefully observed Han Jin's every move. Han Jin was hesitant. The other 4 flying swords were used to release the 1,000 waves. There was no need to waste vital energy on them. The green light in his hand was his main weapon. Footsteps came from behind. Yelena went around the tree and stood beside Han Jin. "You didn't sleep last night?" "I slept. I just woke up," Han Jin replied. "Gibran told me to tell you that we have to speed up today." "They're up to?" "Yes." "No problem. I was worried about you. Can you keep up with us?" "Worried about me?" Yelena pouted. "If it weren't for you guys, I would have caught up with Winston and the others." Han Jin smiled and did not say anything. Seeing that Han Jin did not seem to believe her, Yelena couldn't help but shout, "Hey, Raphael, do you think a Magus can't even master the flying spell?" "Flying spell?" Han Jin's eyes suddenly lit up. Because the enemies he had provoked before were too strong, he had been trying to increase his combat power. Moreover, he could release Earth Meld continuously, so there was nothing to improve on in terms of speed. He had neglected that the flying sword was not just a weapon for fighting. Han Jin couldn't help but jump up and pat Yelena's shoulder. Good. You Yelena's shoulder hurt from the pat. She took a step back. Be gentle. What's so good about it? Would you believe me if I said I can fly too? Hanjin laughed. Yelena looked at Hanjin up and down. There were only two ways to fly in the air. One was to have wings, and the other was to be able to control the wind element. However, she couldn't see which one Hanjin meant. Yelena asked, really? Of course it's true, and my speed is much faster than yours. I don't believe you. Yelena's temper was aroused. As a companion, she could tolerate Hanjin bragging in front of her, but he couldn't look down on her. Although she majored in thunder magic, she had extremely strong spiritual power and could perfectly control the wind element. Her flying speed was faster than most birds. She really didn't believe that Hanjin could be faster than her. Not now, Hanjin said. If he enchanted the flying sword with the flight spell, he would consume a lot of vital energy, which would be disadvantageous for him in battle. He could only wait for a few days. After we find Winston, let's compete. Okay. Yelena accepted Hanjin's challenge without fear. It's boring to just bet. How about we add some stakes? Hanjin said with a smile. He was in such a good mood that he even joked with Yelena. If I win, you have to give me the gift you promised me immediately. Also, I want this. Yelena's eyes fell on the green glow. She had been drooling over it for a long time. Then, she provoked him with a provocative tone. Do you dare? No problem. Hanjin nodded. What if I win? Up to you. Yelena was very generous because she was confident. Up to me? Hanjin laughed. Betting with a man? You'll lose out if you make such a promise. After that, Hanjin walked out. Hey, wait. Yelena hurriedly caught up and grabbed Hanjin's wrist. Julia, Leger, come here quickly. Gibran and the others thought that something had happened and rushed out of the cave one after another. When they saw Hanjin and Yelena standing there hand in hand, they were stunned. Just now, Raphael said that he can also fly in the air, and that his speed is much faster than mine. Yelena said loudly, I've already made a bet with him. After we find Winston and the others, I'll compete with him. If he loses, this beautiful little sword will be mine. You have to be my witnesses. Gibran looked at Hanjin in surprise. They all knew that the little green sword was Hanjin's treasure. As a professional, he would never give up his weapon easily. It was no different from giving up his life. Julia said, What if you lose? Up to him. He can have whatever he wants. Hanjin was a little dumbfounded. He stared blankly at Yelena. The so-called bet was just to vent the excitement in his heart. He didn't take it seriously. Yelena was jumping into a fire pit happily. Seeing that Hanjin's expression was a little strange, Yelena rolled her eyes and smiled. I know it's your treasure. Don't worry, I'll study it for a few days and then return it to you. If you can win, I'll give it to you. Hanjin shook his head helplessly. Yelena, don't cry when the time comes. Chapter 234. The elements in a natural world were always in a mysterious state of balance. Releasing magic to manipulate the elements was a man-made disruption of the balance, which resulted in waves of irregular elemental fluctuations. When the elements returned to balance under the interference of nature, the elemental fluctuations would naturally disappear. The elemental waves caused by mages were always periodic. Even a forbidden spell would not be able to escape the interference of nature. However, at this moment, the elemental waves coming from afar were like an endless song. It had been half a day, but there were no signs of it weakening. When the magical fluctuations came, the mercenaries on the hilltop had already entered battle mode. Only the mages remained silent. It was not yet time to release magic, as that would only alert the enemy. There was a commotion in the woods on the opposite side. Winston was the first to jump out. Without stopping for a moment, he strode towards the hilltop, followed by Saxon. Then Paul and Fiddy jumped out of the woods one after another. Dozens of thunderbirds suddenly swooped down from the dark clouds. Almost at the same time, each thunderbird released a bolt of lightning that was as thick as a wooden barrel. Dozens of lightning bolts converged into a single point in the woods. Then, screams came from the woods, and everything became silent. Winston, Saxon, and the others did not dare to look back. Even though they knew that one of their companions had been killed, they did not dare to look back. Rescue would be useless, and they would only lose their lives. Originally, they were prepared. They had been to Thunder Valley before and had enough experience dealing with thunderbirds. The strength of a flock of thunderbirds was indeed terrifying, but magic beasts were still magic beasts. There were many ways to deal with them. However, something unexpected happened. Winston would never have thought that the thunderbirds of Thunder Valley, under the command of dozens of ogre shamans, were already waiting for them halfway. The plan they prepared could only deceive the thunderbirds, which lacked intelligence, but it could not deceive the ogre shamans. Cervantes of the Dawn Mercenary Corps smiled and nodded to the archers. More than 20 archers simultaneously half-knelt there and drew their longbows. The moment the archers revealed themselves, Winston and the others immediately discovered the ill-intentioned mercenaries on top of the mountain. Paul rolled to the side as fast as he could while releasing his invisibility spell. Saxon roared and released his protective fighting aura to the extreme, blocking in front of Fiddy. Meanwhile, Winston's figure suddenly moved and shot straight toward the top of the mountain. More than 20 arrows were shot out. If they were dealing with an ordinary mercenary team, this row of arrows would be enough. However, the Reapers were a mercenary team with rich combat experience. The strength of the members was also very strong. Although they were suddenly attacked, each of them made the correct response. Paul was out of the attack range, while Fiddy was behind Saxon and was in a blind spot. Only Saxon was hit by a few arrows, but those arrows penetrated his protective combat energy and then hit his leather armor. Their strength was exhausted, and they were unable to cause any damage to Saxon. However, the speed of Saxon's escape was hindered. More thunderbirds swooped down from the dark clouds. Dozens of lightning bolts converged on Fiddy's body, forming a huge electric ball that then exploded with a bang. The magic shield that Fiddy had cast on himself might be able to resist the lightning released by a few thunderbirds, but there were too many thunderbirds. Not to mention Fiddy. Even a peak 11th grade magus would find it difficult to remain unharmed under the collective attack of dozens of thunderbirds. The chaotic flow of electricity swept in all directions. Fiddy had completely disappeared, and he didn't even have time to scream. Saxon, on the other hand, was thrown more than 20 meters away and fell heavily to the ground. Cervantes! Winston let out a roar, his face distorted. His originally calm eyes became abnormally vicious at this moment. He had already recognized the mercenary corps on the opposite side. Cervantes laughed and jumped out of the trench. He calmly looked at Winston, who was getting closer and closer. A white ball of combat energy enveloped his whole body. If it was a one-on-one fight, he would not be afraid of Winston, even if Winston had become incomparably crazy. The 5 types of fighting techniques each had their own strengths. In comparison, Winston's Dragon Flame fighting technique was very balanced in offense and defense. The Galaxy fighting technique posed a serious threat to mages. The starlight condensed from combat energy could penetrate the magic shield and cause direct damage to mages. Warriors of other professions would not be able to harm mages before their magic shield collapsed. Cervantes, on the other hand, practiced the lightning fighting technique, which was much more effective than the ice fighting technique in dealing with melee professions. Once the small probability of paralysis was activated, it would be the deciding factor between life and death. Although for high-grade professions like Winston, the paralysis would only cause him to be stiff for a moment, but in a battle between masters, a moment was enough. Saxon jumped up from the ground and roared as he rushed up the mountain. In fact, he already understood that today was the day that the Reaper Mercenary Corps would be completely eliminated. However, there were different ways to die. He chose to fight to the last breath. Cervantes pulled out his long sword and pointed to the side. The dozen or so mages understood tacitly and released detection, magic one after another. In an instant, hundreds of meters of space were covered. Paul, who was galloping, appeared, But he did not stop for a moment and continued to rush up the mountain. Dozens of thunderbirds began to swoop down again, and the magic fluctuations became more and more intense. The smile on Cervantes' face suddenly disappeared, and he looked up at the sky. Not good. One after another, straight bolts of lightning mercilessly fell from the sky, enveloping the entire mountain. People's bodies, weapons, and countless stones were bombarded in all directions. The mercenaries of the Dawn Mercenary Corps thought that they had a great advantage. With the cooperation of the Thunderbirds, they could easily wipe out the Reaper Mercenary Corps. They never expected that the mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind, and they themselves became the target of a surprise attack. Perhaps it was a coincidence, or perhaps it was deliberate, but the magic fluctuation was hidden in the fluctuations caused by the Thunderbirds. The mercenaries of the Dawn Mercenary Corps were not alerted at all. The dozen or so mages who did not release protective magic bore the brunt of the attack, and were all killed on the spot. The archers who had drawn their longbows and aimed at Paul were also turned into broken limbs. The mercenary soldiers were not much better. Cervantes, on the other hand, was safe. The lightning fighting technique he practiced had an extremely strong resistance against lightning magic. However, his subordinates were all killed. 9-grid Thundercall. This was the signature magic. Both sides understood who was nearby almost at the same time. Cervantes turned his head angrily, looking for the hiding place of the enemy. However, before he could find the enemy, a sharp wind quietly swept towards his neck. Cervantes reacted very quickly. He dodged to the side and sent back his sword. Gibran appeared in the air, and his figure spun, avoiding Cervantes' sword. The first move was a draw, and no one could hurt the other. Cervantes' expression changed drastically, and he quickly dodged to the side. If Gibran was here, Julia would definitely be here too. The Trent's arrow didn't feel good, and he could only rely on swimming quickly to avoid getting into trouble. However, Cervantes' movements were still a little slow. Julia and Gibran attacked at the same time. When he dodged Gibran's sneak attack and returned a blow, Julia's arrow had already arrived. A green light flashed, and countless vines surged out from the ground like a tide. Cervantes' body had already moved, but he was pulled back by the vines. Winston roared, and his body shot into the air like a cannonball. He drew an arc and fell toward Cervantes. He raised a long sword high above his head with both hands. He had used all his strength and fighting spirit. Winston's swordsmanship was originally focused on stabbing. Now that he was acting out of character, one could imagine how angry he was. This sword had nothing to do with skill, but was just to vent. Cervantes roared and struggled with all his might. Unfortunately, the Trent's arrow was the nemesis of the strong. Unless one had the strength of a super strong person and could break all the vines at once, it would be impossible to escape. He broke one, but new vines grew out and could only bind him tighter and tighter. Winston swung his sword down, and the explosion instantly burned the waving vines into charcoal. Cervantes' body was also burned. Winston's long sword had deeply cut into his forehead, almost splitting his head in half. Cervantes suddenly froze and then softly fell to the ground. The diving Thunderbirds released a dazzling electric light. Under the command of the Ogre Shaman, their attacks were very orderly. Paul had not yet rushed out of the magic detection range, but his body was already enveloped by the electric light. When the electric light disappeared, there was nothing left. This was an absolute kill, and also an absolute instant kill. Go! Gibran shouted. He did not even care about attacking the surviving mercenaries of the Dawn Mercenary Corps. He turned around and rushed to the back of the hill. Winston also knew that now was not the time to kill to vent his anger. He stepped forward and followed closely behind Gibran. As for Saxon, who was lagging behind, he was really powerless. Facing the attack of dozens of Thunderbirds, there was no point in rescuing him, and he would only be sacrificed. At the foot of the hill, a dozen black shadows rushed out of the forest. They were the Ogre Shamans, and they were all riding on tall windwolves. Ogres were very ugly creatures. Their skin was very rough, and they were an ugly greenish-gray color. Their heads were very large, and their eyes were not small. Their mouths were completely bloody, and their shining fangs were protruding out. It was terrifying to look at. Ogres were very powerful in battle. Just like vampires, they were born with tough bodies. However, in comparison, the ogre shamans' bodies were much weaker. But they often became the leaders of the ogres because they could release magic, and they also had the innate ability to communicate with magical beasts. Seeing that the enemy had escaped from the top of the hill, the ogre shamans hurriedly urged on their wind wolves. At this moment, a sudden change occurred. A figure suddenly jumped out from the ground, waving a shining green light, and slashed at the neck of an ogre shaman. The shaman was caught off guard, and a huge head flew high into the air. The figure did not stop for a moment and continued to rush forward. With a flash of green light, another ogre shaman fell into a pool of blood, screaming. The rest of the ogre shamans hurriedly scattered in all directions. The flock of thunderbirds that were chasing Saxon also gave up their target at the same time and collectively turned around to protect the ogre shamans. Saxon originally thought that he was going to die, but when he saw that the flock of thunderbirds had given up on him, he could not help but cry tears of joy. No one was willing to face death, and going to die didn't mean that they wanted to die. He used all his strength to jump up the hill and then disappeared on the other side. Hanjin used his green light and wanted to kill another enemy, but he saw a huge rock about 2 meters in diameter coming straight at him. Before the rock even got close, the strong wind that came from it made his cheeks hurt. Hanjin's body hurriedly fell back and disappeared without a trace. In the next moment, a huge man about 5 meters tall rushed out of the forest. With just 2 or 3 steps, he arrived at the place where Hanjin had disappeared. He waved an absurdly large hammer and smashed it down with all his might. With a loud bang, the ground shook violently. The wind wolves were shaken, and the remaining ogre shamans covered their ears in pain. The huge man continued to smash the ground a few more times, and forcibly smashed a large hole in the ground. He then squatted down and used his hands to dig for something. After a moment, he raised his head and said in a daze, "No, ignore him. Let's continue to chase." An ogre shaman screamed. His opinion received the approval of all the ogre shamans. But just as the thunderbirds in the sky changed direction, Hanjin unexpectedly jumped out from behind another gale wolf. He raised his sword and pierced another ogre shaman's body. Then, Hanjin moved his body and rushed toward another ogre shaman. The shaman was already on guard. He raised his cane, and his greenish-gray skin suddenly turned iron black. The green light only left a shallow mark on his skin. Hanjin was stunned. He flipped his hand and threw out a fire talisman. The 3 true flames fell on the shaman's back, and instantly turned into a ball of raging flames. The smug smile on the shaman's face instantly disappeared, and he let out a miserable scream. However, with the addition of a fire talisman, Hanjin's movements were interrupted and slowed down. The thunderbirds in the sky released streaks of lightning, and Hanjin's body was enveloped in them. With a boom, sand and stones flew everywhere. Hanjin reappeared in another place and disappeared into the earth. The huge man rushed over and squatted down to carefully observe, but he couldn't find anything. The ogre shamans looked at each other in dismay. The huge man gave up and threw away his hammer. He ran far away and picked up the stone he had just thrown. He hugged the stone and looked around. He was about 5 meters tall, and the stone was 2 meters wide. According to the ratio, it should be very difficult for him to lift it. However, the huge man seemed to have infinite strength and looked very relaxed. "What do we do?" a shaman asked in a muffled voice. "Ignore him," another shaman shouted. "Let's keep chasing." This time, the ogre shamans didn't move even though they were yelling that they wanted to chase after Hanjin. Their skin had all turned iron black, and a flock of thunderbirds continued to hover above their heads. Obviously, it was for Hanjin to hear. After waiting for a long time, the ogre shamans couldn't bear it anymore. They exchanged glances and urged their gale wolves to move forward. Who knew that just as they began to move, Hanjin would jump out from behind. Seeing the ogre shaman's skin all changed color, he didn't hesitate and wave his hand to throw out a fire talisman. The giant man roared and threw the boulder out, but Hanjin had already sunk into the ground. The boulder missed its target and flew all the way, smashing down countless trees along the way. The shaman who was hit by the three true fire screamed as he rolled down from the Gale Wolf. His back rubbed against the Gale Wolf's body. As a result, the Gale Wolf also suffered. One was rolling on the ground desperately, while the other was frantically spinning around. "Barker, what are you waiting for? Put out the fire," an ogre shaman shouted. The huge man rushed in front of the shaman and raised his hand to slap him. Another ogre shaman shouted, "No, that fire is strange. Don't touch it with your hands." The huge man was stunned. He ran to the side, grabbed a tree that had just been smashed, and slammed it down. The ogre shaman screamed and dodged to the side. Unexpectedly, Hanjin took the opportunity to come out of the ground. He raised his hand and threw out a fire talisman, turning another ogre shaman into a man of fire. The huge man's reaction was not bad. He stepped on the tree and broke it in half, then turned around and threw the thick trunk. However, Hanjin had just been defeated by the faked earth corpse, so he became very cautious. After killing one ogre, he immediately hid underground. The whistling tree trunk didn't even touch his shadow. The huge man was really angry. He beat his chest with his fists and roared. Both the ogre shaman and the Gale Wolf were lying in a pool of blood, but the three true fire of Samadhi was still burning. Their bodies were badly mutilated, but it had nothing to do with Hanjin. It was all the work of the giant man. Seeing their companions being killed one by one, the ogre shaman showed fear. The huge man didn't admit defeat. He ran far away to pick up his boulder and kept spinning there. "We can't care about him anymore. Even if there's only one of us left, we have to kill those people," an ogre shaman screamed. "Okay," another ogre shaman agreed. Just as the Gale Wolf was about to move, Hanjin jumped out of the ground and threw out a fire talisman. The huge man also threw out his boulder, but this time he didn't attack Hanjin. Instead, he attacked the flame. Hanjin's fire talisman was very fast, but the huge man was very talented in this aspect. Moreover, the boulder was very big, so he had a big advantage. With a boom, the fire talisman hit the boulder and burned fiercely. The ogre shaman who was attacked was only scared and broke out in a cold sweat, but he was safe and sound. The flock of thunderbirds had already released bolts of lightning. As Hanjin's figure disappeared into the ground, they all shot towards the ground. The roaring lightning struck the ground, creating a huge pit nearly 2 meters deep. Seeing that his plan worked, the huge man roared in the direction where Hanjin disappeared. "I'm strong." After shouting, he happily ran over and picked up his boulder. Whether he was strong or not was another matter. His intelligence was a problem. The ogre shaman just reminded him that there was something wrong with the flame and that he shouldn't touch it. But he forgot in the blink of an eye. The surviving ogre shamans surrounded the crater, their attention focused on the bottom of the crater. "Is he dead?" an ogre shaman whispered. "Should be dead." The giant man was not afraid of the flames. He smiled and picked up the burning boulder, turned around, and walked back. However, he had only taken a few steps when the boulder fell to the ground. He stared blankly at his burning hands. No one knew what he was thinking. The sound of the boulder falling to the ground startled the ogre shamans. They turned around and were stunned. The huge man was holding 2 balls of flame in his hands, and there was also a flame burning in his chest. "Buck, didn't I tell you not to touch it?" an ogre shaman screamed. "How are you, Buck?" another ogre shaman shouted. He asked this because other people would scream when they touched the flame, but Buck just stood there blankly, as if nothing had happened. Barker raised his head, the muscles on his face trembling nonstop. "It hurts." The ogre shamans were stunned. "If you're in pain, you should scream." They knew that Buck was a very rough guy, but to this extent, they couldn't understand. Buck strode to the ogre shamans and stretched out his hand. "Extinguish. Extinguish." The ogre shamans scattered to the left and right. The nature of the flame was very strange, and they couldn't do anything about it. Besides, Their purpose was to increase the fighting power of the whole race and control large numbers of magic beasts. The magic they mastered was also of the effect type. In a real battle, these shamans couldn't even beat a human warlock. Extinguish the flame. Seeing that his companions didn't care about his life and were retreating to other places, Buck, who was in great pain, finally shouted a complete sentence. The ogre shamans didn't respond. Instead, they retreated even further. Extinguish the flame. Buck was furious. He strode to catch up with an ogre shaman and pressed down with his hand. He was so strong that his palm pressed the ogre shaman's head into his chest. The headless corpse with flames floating around its neck swayed a few times and fell down. Run! He's crazy! The ogre shamans were shocked. They turned around and drove the gale wolves to escape into the forest. Buck's body was big and tall. He caught up with an ogre shaman in a single step. He reached out and grabbed the shaman's neck, lifting him up. Extinguish. Another ogre shaman saw this and hurriedly screamed. The thunderbirds, circling in the air, began to dive down. Bolts of lightning gathered on Buck's body and made an earth-shattering sound. When the lightning dissipated, Buck did not disappear completely like the others who were attacked by the thunderbirds. However, his body was much thinner. From head to toe, white bones could be seen everywhere. Blood gushed out like a fountain. Then, he swayed and fell straight to the ground, crushing an ogre shaman who was staring at him in shock. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.